The Making of Cuba in New York, which came out in NYU Press just last year, which was a culmination of years of research on the Cuban community in New York City during the 19th century. The book traces how that community was shaped by both the sugar trade and the long struggle for independence from Spain. And I learned last night that if you all go up to New York and want an extraordinary tour of, which is the cemetery?
Greenwood Cemetery.
Greenwood Cemetery, of all the illustrious Cubans that are buried there from New York. Lisandro does a tour twice a year, and I'm going to definitely sign up next time I'm up there. So it's with great pleasure that we welcome Lisandro Perez to our visit.
So yes, I lately have been studying dead Cubans. The thing about studying dead Cubans is that unlike the ones I study in Miami, they don't answer back. So anyway, thank you very much, not only for inviting me, but really for having this great seminar, for persuading NEH to support a seminar on this topic, which of course is dear to my heart, dear to many of us who've been working on this, including Johnny Boyle, who we heard about yesterday. So I want to thank you very much for the invitation. It's a pleasure to be here. So this is going to be a little bit of a different presentation. If I look at my phone every once in a while, it's not because I'm waiting for a call from the Escanel or anything like that, because I don't have a watch. There's no one here. Not one here, so I got to look at my watch here. Okay? Not that I'm being rude, looking at my watch while I'm talking. So this presentation will be perhaps a little different because the topic here that you have is Florida cigar making communities, right? This is not about a Florida cigar making community. And it is about Marti, but it's Marti from a New York perspective, right? Because I'm looking at this, and I'm looking at Marti, and I'm going to talk about Marti here from the perspective of Florida, from the perspective of New York City, right? Which is where I did my work. This, of course, anybody recognize the statue? I know Kenya does. Where is this? Yes.
Central Park South.
Central Park South, at the, right where the Avenue of the Americas, right? Comes into 57th Avenue, right? Sculpture by Anna Hyatt Huntington. It was put up there in the early 60s, after it had been already done in the 1950s. Anna Hyatt Huntington, of course, was a sculptor. She actually, this was not a commission, she donated the statue, right? And she always did horses, right? That's what she did, horses, you know, these monumental statues of horses. So of course Marti had to be on a horse, and the only time we know for sure he was on a horse is when he got killed. So it's showing Marti at the moment, right? In which we do his hit. It's actually a very dramatic statue. I don't happen to like it because again, the statue of Marti had a desk, right? Marti, right? You know, Marti writing something or whatever, not on a horse, right? And of course, this is more. He's also, of course, has a suit on, like he's walking around New York instead of in the middle of the Cuban countryside. We know he wasn't dressed that way. There is, by the way, one of the recent things that has happened is that the Bronx Museum, in coordination with the historian of the city of Havana, has made a replica, an exact replica of this statue. And I had the pleasure of being invited January 28th of last year, 2018, to the inauguration of the statue in Havana. So there's an actual statue, a replica of the statue in Havana. Right? Anyway, Marti in New York, here he is. Okay? There isn't a plaque where it should be, which is at Front Street, where his office was, right? And actually it's an ideal place, and some people have, Esther Allen has been, you know, fighting for that for a long time, because it's actually an ideal place for those public spaces between buildings there in New York, and it's perfect for a plaque. So, a lot of what I'm saying here is based upon my recent book. Let me say also that I may talk like a historian, this may be like a work in history, but I'm actually even worse than that, I'm a sociologist. Okay, I was trained as a sociologist. Most of my work has been on the contemporary Cuban presence in the United States, right? And I was at FIU for a long time, did research in Miami, but I was always interested in the history. First of all, I think I have the soul of a historian. But in addition to that, I was always interested in the history of the Cuban presence in the United States. And I always thought that New York was not getting its due in terms of the Cuban presence. There are a lot of stuff on the Florida cigar making communities, right? I mean, I started my book out by saying, this is not about, you know, the Florida cigar making communities. There's an extensive bibliography, Mormino and, you know, Westfall and starting and so forth on the Florida cigar making communities, but there hasn't been a lot on New York City. Okay, so that was part of one reason why I wrote this book, and so I kind of became a historian, but I still approached it as a sociologist. Okay, so the book, and this is not a plug, but just to show you, it is. I guess it is. This is the title of the book. The book actually was not even originally about Marti. Right? I was in kindergarten in Havana when Cuba celebrated the 100th anniversary of the birth of Marti, right? It's centenary. And I remember, you know, this figure of Marti like he was some sort of demigod, whatever. So when I started, and as an undergraduate, and, my family left Cuba in 1960, I left with them when I was 11 years old. When I started getting into Cuba and researching about Cuba as an undergraduate, whatever, I was ready to really reject most of the canons that I had, you know, heard about, right, growing up, and a lot of the myth making. Right? By the way, if you have, I don't want to talk here for, if you have some questions or comments you want to make as I go along, please feel free. Although Jerry Pollo said, be careful with that, because they will do that. You'll never get to where you're going. Okay? So I will take questions along what I'm saying. I don't want to talk now about U.S. policy towards Cuba, for example, right? That's not going into all kinds of topics right now, right? But especially if we're doing this. So, this was not originally about Marti. I was prepared not to focus on Marti because I felt that whenever I told people, what are you working on? People asked me what I was working on. I said, I'm working on history of Cubans in New York in the 19th century. Yes, Marti. I said, no, actually it started much earlier than that. And part of what I'm going to talk about is why it's important to know the context in which Marti enters. Not only the context of New York, but the context of the history of Cuban émigré politics, which predates him by quite a bit. Right? He arrives in 1880. In terms of history of Cuban New York, that is late. Right? When he arrives already. So that's part of what I want to talk about, and part of what really this book is about. So I was prepared to ignore Marti in this book, but in reality there's no ignoring Marti, right? In the sense that once I saw the context in which he entered, you know, the context he functioned in, let's say, and what he did, he really broke the mold in many ways of what had been Cuban émigré activism up to that point, especially in New York. And I think it's important also to understand New York and the context that he was in. Because sometimes, you know, a lot of people in literature, no offense, you know, sometimes, you know, they talk about Marti as if he was, you know, floating, you know, somewhere, right? Like he wasn't with his feet on the ground in a particular place, right? And I think it's important to put him in, especially in a place like New York. And some people, I remember when I talked about Marti in New York, some people say, oh yeah, somebody in the Centro de Estudios Martianos in Havana once told me, oh yeah, the stage, that stage of Marti's life is very interesting. That stage of Marti's life, this is like, I don't know, Hemingway in Paris or something, are you kidding me? Look at the dates, right? Look at the dates, right? He arrives there, he's not even 27 years old, right? And he leaves right before he dies at 42. This is the majority of his adult life, right? Where he's living. This is not just some New York phase of his, right? This is where most of the stuff that you're reading about him, or much of the stuff you're reading that he wrote, actually he wrote in New York, right? And all that political organizing that he did, right, started in New York. I know Jerry and Pollo emphasized Key West and all that, and I know, but I'm going to make an argument here for New York just to balance that out, okay, a little bit, in terms of the importance of New York. So if you look at the dates, right, it wasn't just, you know, some stage in his life, right? This was very important. So let's before I get into some of the heart of what I want to talk about, let's talk a little bit about Marti, what he wrote about New York, right? And we're going to see a kind of a ambivalence, if you will, right, about about New York, which is understandable, and we'll talk about that a little bit later, right? So here's one thing he says in 1886. This is my road. I have faith and take joy in it. Everything ties me to New York. Everything ties me to this cup of poison. Right? So that might not seem, I forgot to bring out, I was going to read something from the book, but let me just bring it out and then I forgot to, excuse me. And then you have that quote. And then he has, in the letter that he writes earlier to Guillermo de Sendigui, a friend of his, who writes to him and says, you think I can make a living in New York? And here's what he replies. You're interested in knowing whether you can find a way to make a living in New York. In my judgment, I depend solely on things that suit your master, the language of this land, and your determination. You must summon all your determination to enter the herd, el rebaño, in which the workers of this city live. But it is a herd of kings. Right? So, I mean, that's another view, right? That's another view of New York, right? And I would argue that they're not necessarily contradictory. I think that he took great pleasure in living in New York, at the same time that he could see that it was, so in many ways, kind of what we call a cup of poison. Right? It meant he was separated from his family, right? He made that decision, right? In 1882, when he writes that, he must be looking ahead and he's already probably made the decision that he's not going to have his family there. Or rather, his family, his wife made the decision they weren't going to be there, right? The other way, and he was going to just have to live with that, right? So, you know, so let me, the next thing I want to do before I get into the heart of things is kind of do what I do in this book with all the other Cubans that I talk about in New York, put him on the ground. Right? In other words, let's look at him, and for this I go to some documents. I understand some of you are doing some research with primary documents. Let me give you a sense of what I was working with when I did this book, because again, I'm a sociologist. So when I said, okay, I'm going to look at Cuban New York, the first thing I wanted to look at was things like censuses and things like that, not archives necessarily. I got into those later, right? Not archives. So here's the manifest. We're going to see him arriving in New York, January 3rd, 1880. This is the manifest of the France. Right, that arrives in January of 1880 from the Havre into Manhattan, and here's passenger number 30. Pointer.
This should be the red button,
The
right in the middle
button.
there, on the
Oh,
front.
Yes, I'm sorry. So here's Mr. Marti, passenger number 30, 26 years of age. That's true. He had not yet turned 27. This means he was in second class. He is male. He is an advocate. Right? A lawyer. Right? And he is, of course, a citizen of Spain. He's carrying a Spanish passport. Right? So there he is on the ship coming in. Right? So one of the things that I also use a lot in this book, and we'll see it also in the case of Marti, is that I use the censuses a lot. And this was Jerry Boyer and I had a long conversation last night about precisely the use of the censuses in research, because it now becomes possible through tools like Ancestry, right, to look up not just specific people like your ancestors, but one of the things I did was I actually looked up, when you look at Ancestry, instead of putting a name, you put a place of birth, Cuba. Where? New York. 1880 census. Press the button. It dumps out 1,000, 2,000 records, right, of everybody who answered Cuba, right, in the census, right, and who lived in New York and who was enumerated in the 1880 census. Right? So the censuses, and of course at that time, this is what that would look like. Ancestry, and I was using, when I started this project, I was using something called heritage.com as well, which was also another source of this, right? This is what the image will look like, because of course back then, as you know, they were like ledger sheets, right? There were these huge things, and the originals of this, by the way, are in New York, in the Federal Building. It's a huge sheet. The enumerator would go around and then, you know, indicate the number, the family, the household number, and then the address, the number. This is, for example, is 4th Avenue, right? And then start enumerating across. This is so-and-so, and write this down, right? So what happens is that when you come up, say, you look for a Cuban, you look at somebody born Cuban, it'll dump the whole page. So you not only know the Cubans, you also know, you know, they're next door neighbors. Right? For example, interesting things like the widow of Domingo Urcuria, right, who was killed in Cuba during the 10-year war. His widow lived next to Herman Melville, who of course was a clerk in the custom house, right? That's what he was, right? And so this particular page contains this entry, right, which is the household, right, of Manuel Mantilla, right, who is a white male, 37 years old, who is a merchant. So his wife Carmen Mantilla, who is Carmen Millares de Mantilla, right, and she's running a boarding house. She's a white female, 29 years old. She has a son, Manuel, 9, a daughter, Carmen, a daughter, Ernesto. Of course, these get anglicized because the enumerator is listening to this and writing down, right? Ernesto. And then she's got borders, right? Which are this individual, this individual. And of course, this is June 1880, and Marti, up until recently, was living here. This is where he lived, and this is, of course, Carmen Mantilla, who is alleged to be the mother also of a daughter that Marti fathered with her, right? And this is the boarding house where he lived. He's not living here anymore, interestingly enough, right? But we do know from research that somebody else has done that this individual, Edwin Steuben, was a Pinkerton agent. Right?
Pinkerton
A Pinkerton agent, you know, Pinkertons, right? The guys who killed Jesse James and all that, and busted a lot of union people, right? Heads, right? Well, the Spanish government had contracted Pinkertons to look after people. Yeah, they have done that. They have done that since the 1860s, when the 10-year war. So somebody looking in the archives in Mexico, in Madrid, of the foreign ministry, right, saw the receipts for Mr. Steuben, right, because he was there spying on Marti, but Marti was not there. Marti was like a block and a half away in this household, which is also a boarding house run by Mr. Beers. And here he is in June of 1880. You see him down here, José Martí, white male, 30. This sounds like an estimate, right? Like they went to the house and said, who else lives here? Well, it's a guy named Martí. Right? About how old is he? He's about 30 years old. He's a boarder, right? No occupation. He's born in Cuba. I'm not sure why he's living there. This is a time in which his wife, Carmen Sayas Pasan, is in New York, right, in one of her unsuccessful trips to get her husband back to Cuba and live a respectable life, right? And so, but he shows up here, right? This is 1880. I can't do this for 1890. Nobody can. Because the records, the census records, the original sheets for New York burned, right, in a fire in the 1920s. Right? So we can't do it. They couldn't have gotten digitized. Right? So I'm doing this a bit because I know that some of you are interested in doing research on some of these things, and I just found fascinating the idea of, and again, I do this for Marti, but most of my work on my book is actually with the emigres of the 1868 war, right? The start of 1868, most of whom are buried at Greenwood, by the way, right? Including Miguel Aldama, and Bernardo del Monte, and José Morales Lemus, and all these people that are buried there. So he had his favorite places, and going back to the Herd of Kings, for example, he liked to go to Delmonico's a lot, right? Delmonico's, of course, was a pioneer in what we call restaurants in the United States, right? This is 25th, this is 25th, and, Madison and 25th Street, right? Where Delmonico's relocated to, right? Very expensive, and he loved it. He has a couple of descriptions of Delmonico's, right? The legend is that on the day of his last birthday, January 28th, he celebrated his birthday there, right, in that Delmonico's restaurant, right? And another thing he loved was Barnum and Bailey's, right? Right? And so we know that because he actually wrote about, you know, we owe a special gratitude to people who make our lives better by entertaining us. And Mr. Barnum is a genius, right, and entertainment. And there was a little, when he finally persuades Máximo Gómez to go back in 1892, right, back to New York to lead, you know, the war, and he's courting Máximo Gómez, he leaves a note for his secretary, Gonzalo de Quesada, says, I'm taking the general to Barnum's tonight, right? And sure enough, if you can imagine that scene, right? Marti and Máximo Gómez, the general, sitting there watching a show, you know, all this extravaganza. And I actually looked up the show that was on that time, and it featured a couple of chimpanzees, right, who would act out a parody of the agony and ecstasy of married life. Right? You can see these guys sitting there at Barnum's, you know, at Barnum's, so, you know, taking this in, right? So he really did essentially enjoy New York. This is one of his favorite places. So let me talk, getting to the core of what I want to talk about. And this just puts him, I just wanted to put him as a human being in New York, right? Where he lived. By the way, the house of Carmen Montilla was on essentially Park Avenue and 29th, somewhere in there. Right? So let me give you a sense of where I'm going, okay, with this. The core of what I want to talk about. First, I want to talk about his New York milieu. And I would need some help on this because I'm sure there's some of you who know this more than I do. That is, what did New York look like in the 1880s? What did New York represent? What was this place that Marti lived in? Right? Then, really what I want to talk about more centrally is the lessons he learned from the history of Cuban émigré activism in New York. And this will take me into a little bit of that history, right? To show what preceded him in New York in terms of the tradition of Cuban émigré activism. Then I have what I call, if we have time, and it looks like I will have it because everybody's quiet. Bonus content, what I call the absent chronicles, las crónicas ausentes. And by that I mean of the escenas norteamericanas. Given what Marti was looking at, given what Marti was experiencing, how come we didn't write about this? Right? The absent chronicles, right? And I'll give a couple of examples. You'll see, how did Marti not write about this? And it tells us something about how he chose to write about things, especially in the escenas norteamericanas. Right? Okay, so the New York milieu. Tell me, what New York in the 1880s, right? What kind of city was that? What did it represent? Right? I mean, this was a place where things were happening for the first time, almost anywhere. Right? And Martí was in the middle of that. Pedro Pablo Rodriguez, right, from the Centro de Estudios Martianos, right? One of the things that he says was, he was a modern man in one of the meccas of modernity. Right? And so we talk about his modernismo, right? And so for the literature, okay, well, he wasn't just anywhere, right? He was in New York in the 1880s, right? So what kind of things were happening in New York? Right? I have my list, and I want to see if some of you who are sociologists, historians, whatever, can tell me more. Right? What characters? Yes, go ahead.
It's the biggest port in America.
Yes, it is the biggest port
And the biggest manufacturing center.
Yes. So you have the port, by the way, the port is going to be, can I write on here?
Yeah, sure.
Right? Or is this?
Yeah.
All right. There's a port which all that means, right? Part of what all of that means is the kind of in and out, right? Port cities like Havana, right? Which at one time was larger than New York, by the way. We go back, right? Which like Havana were places where you have red ones. If you know, place like it has a lot of movement. It has a lot of people from different places. Right? What else? What else did you say? I'm sorry.
Big manufacturing.
Yes, manufacturing. That is manufacturing. No. This is like
Was there any more up there?
Sorry. No. All right. It's okay. Let's go. Manufacturing, industrial, right? This is America, which is still, this is an America that is still rural and agricultural. Right? This is still America that's rural and agricultural. It's amazing, if you look at, now for you sociologists, the 1920 census was the first census in the United States. The 1920 census was the first census in the United States in which a majority of people lived in towns or cities above 5,000. You think of how rural, you know, that goes a long way to explain a lot of things in the U.S., by the way, in terms of the rural, you know, values and things like that. That's not going to do. Yes, go ahead.
I'm not a historian, but I'm a New Yorker.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I think one of the main things we learn about when we're learning about New York at this time, and you mention it in your writing in your book, is how dirty the city was. And just that all this industry and all of this, the change between the rural and this kind of modernity coming at a price, and that price is tons of garbage and excrement. And thinking about Marti's health, I think when he says this cup of poison, he might mean it like literally to his health. Right? That it was just that dirty of the city.
This is, I'm sorry, that was a great lead-in. I had planned, in fact, to read that part that I have on here, because by 1880, this is a quote from my book, which I quote other people. By 1880, which is the year Marti arrived, New York was the first American city to reach 1 million inhabitants. Half of that population, mostly immigrant, was packed into the Lower East Side, where 70% of the city's deaths occurred. Middle-class New Yorkers lived in multi-dwelling houses, especially boarding houses. And there was no concept of the apartment back then, right? This is a boarding house. Even affluent New Yorkers contributed to the crowding, living in brownstones that, although luxurious, typically occupied over 90% of their lots. The railroad boom created chaotic public scenes of greed as frenzied trading in the New York Stock Exchange spilled into the adjoining downtown streets. Horses, wagons, and pedestrians clogged Manhattan just before the subway. In 1881, observed a sanitary engineer, quote, the city's 40,000 horses produce 400 tons of manure per day and 20,000 gallons of urine and nearly 200 carcasses per day. Yes, the odor of horse droppings is everywhere, carried into houses in the form of dried manure that blows into the cuffs of trousers and the folds of skirts. The 1880s would also bring some of the coldest winters in New York, history culminating in the legendary blizzard of 1888, which Marti, by the way, writes about, right? So this is a hard place, right? This is a difficult place, right? So if you want to talk about the kind of environment he was facing, right? But I mean, let's talk about some other things. How about
immigration?
Immigration, right? Heterogeneity, right?
Even
Even the European capitals, London was not seeing, even with the growth of London, they weren't seeing this kind of heterogeneity with immigration, right? So yes, go ahead.
it was also a make of cultural activity.
Yes, yes, we're looking at the negative side.
Ballet,
Oh,
opera.
Something on news, press.
Everything, the press, very vibrant press, right?
Buildings.
Buildings, technology, progress, right? All these evidences of modernity, yes. Banking, the center, yes, go
In the
ahead.
1880s, Brooklyn Bridge is also opened, and so
Right.
and there's also, and you also said there's no subway, of course, but there are other forms of transit.
Yeah.
There's the elevated train, and there's
Yes. The Third Avenue train was on.
Is
Yeah.
Central Park there again?
Yes, Central Park is there, and he writes about Central Park as well, right? Now that you mentioned the Brooklyn Bridge, right, this was part of what Marti also wrote about, his fascination with the technology, with the signs of progress. I mean, they put up a statue on the bay, which he wrote about. And the Brooklyn Bridge, I mean, we now look at it like nothing in many ways, but you, if you were at that era and you just walked on that bridge for the first time, you were higher than you'd ever been in your life. And there were birds flying below you and ships going below you, you know? This was a place that was just, you know, tremendous.
and it was like more than twice as long as any existing bridge, right? And suspension bridge.
Yeah.
Held up by cables.
And people didn't know if it was going to stand up.
Right.
The story of building the pylons, you know, and the technology to build them, the men that died.
Yeah. I'm
I'm
going to bring that up later because one of the things that I want to talk about is a little bit about the escenas, because that escena, the escena, if you've read it on Brooklyn Bridge, right? Notice that escena, right, does not focus so much on the bridge. It focuses on Emily Roebling, right, who is the wife of the engineer who was incapacitated with the bench because he went down there and he was directing everything to the apartment. She was carrying out. The escenas always have a purpose.
Coney Island.
right?
It's Coney
Always
Island.
have a purpose. And in this case, he wanted to say something about women's roles, about how the role of women is to support the great work of their husbands. Nothing close to you think? Yeah? Nothing close to what, what he's talking about when his wife had just said, if you want to liberate Cuba, go ahead, I'm going back to Cuba, right? About, women should support the great work that men do, right? Like Emily Roebling, right? And stuff like that. So, the Brooklyn Bridge thing is also like another
Coney Island.
Coney Island, or beach.
There's nothing.
Stuff he wrote up. Political corruption also,
Oh, yes.
right? Right? Crime. Okay? What's that? Labor unions and the problem with labor unions at that time. At that time, labor unions were, just generally heterogeneity, right? Poverty, not only poverty, but poverty that became very apparent because you had very, among the poorest people in the United States on the Lower East Side, and then a few blocks away, you had the most, fantastic, sorts of fortunes that have never been seen before, right? Amassed, right? These contrasts, right? This is where Marti, if we put him on the ground, this is where Marti's seeing, right? And the idea that he somehow would not have been influenced by that, because we sort of think of Marti as already a made man, right? He arrives at 27 years old in New York, and he knows what he wants, and this had to have a tremendous impact, right? Well, both looking at this progress and this modernity, which he embraced, by the way, right? Part of his positive thing about the United States is precisely, right, the idea of this is a new way of governing, right? The founding fathers, right, had this view of democracy and everything, which, by the way, led him to some negative things about immigration, because he felt that all these Europeans coming in were bringing those old world notions, right, that might be dangerous, right? All their scars, all their wounds, right, coming from monarchies and from countries that were like Catholic, right, and stuff like that. And so he was, again, a modern man, right? He was sort of, looking at all this. So poverty, tremendous accumulation of wealth, right? The imposition of the industrial, as you said, over the agricultural. This is a manifestation of that, right? Where's my? So here's something that I like about what the milieu is. This is This is a quote from Tom Bender, who's a historian at NYU, who has a great book that I use a lot in this book called New York Inlet. It was in New York that advanced culture and learning first confronted more modern urban conditions. Before their counterparts in any of the great European capitals, men and women of learning in New York had to confront the ideology and practice of democracy on unprecedented social heterogeneity. Right? Because even if you think of London, for example, which might have competed here, it didn't have this kind of level of immigration of all these different cultures. Right? So this is part of what Tom is saying is part of what Marti is. So given this place, esta vorágine, as Pedro Pablo Rodriguez called it, said una vorágine, right? And said Marti had this nervous disposition, so he probably thrived on this kind of movement and whatever, right? When we think New York might have influenced it? Okay, well, let's see, New York and Marti. Social justice, right? The idea that you can't have this kind of wealth like this and poor people like this. Right? And it's reflected in a lot of stuff. For example, again, the Crónicas, the blizzard of 1888. If you look at the Crónica, the escena norteamericana of the blizzard of 1888, his focus is not on, oh my God, there's all this snow, the focus is on the newspaper accounts that he's reading about individuals who die in the snowstorm, literally buried in the snowstorm, because they have to go to work. Because if not, they lose their jobs. Because their employer said, you have to come in and work, right? And so it becomes an escena on the notion of, right, an exploitative system, right? And how, there's this, absence of humanity, right? And they digging people, and I went to the newspapers of that era, and sure enough, there's these illustrations, right, of dead bodies being, dug out from under the mountains of snow, right? And that's what he's reading. You have to keep in mind, we'll get to that later, but the escenas are born out of what Marti is reading, right, in the newspapers. He didn't go to Charleston, right? He wasn't there when they killed Jesse James. You know what I'm saying? I mean, it's what he's reading in the newspaper. So if you go back to those newspapers and you see this is what Marti was reading, then sure enough, there's these scenes, these writing, drawings of people being dug out by the police from the mountains, and so that's what he focuses on. It's not a meteorological event for him, right? It's a case of social injustice, of human tragedy, right? Of greed, right? Which is kind of the next point, kind of this notion of humanity or human values, the human spirit over materialism, right? And as I was indicating there, the scenes, as Tom, as I put in the book there, the scenes of greed of trading in the New York Stock Exchange industry. This was before, of course, J.P. Morgan came and said, we've got to have rules, right? Even the capital system has to have rules, right? There were no rules, right? And there was this tremendous greed, right, going on, and his notion of the importance of, humanity over materialism. Again, the progress, we talk progress, modernity, democracy, right? His fascination in many ways with these technological kinds of inventions, with the notion of progress and the way in which the United States, and this was his positive view, right? And this was where he said it is a herd of kings, right? And the notion of having all these, evident, all this progress, which he was very much in favor of, right? He was not a traditional individual at all. There's a very interesting escena norteamericana, which I have in the book. It hasn't been translated, it's been very little known. There was back in 1885, 86, there was a British cleric, right, who visited New York, I forgot his name, but who visited New York, and he was received with the press fawning over him and stuff like that. He was this sort of silver-haired bishop, a Catholic bishop in Britain, right? And he gave a sermon at one of the churches in New York, one of the Catholic churches, covered by the press, in which he basically said that, the Inquisition was not all that bad. And Marti is like, are you kidding me? And what shocked him was, not with the man's words, which he expected from a Catholic prelate, but the fact, right, that New York welcomed him, right? And he has something like, this man is a magnificent fox, he calls him, who's coming in and talking about these old institutions and this sort of, anachronisms like this, like it's a great thing, right? So, I mean, he was as Pedro Pablo Rodriguez says, he was a man of his era, a modern man, right? And who thrived on this sort of modernity, right? And finally, something we're going to talk about maybe more a little bit later, the anti-expansionists, right? That's also what he's reading in the New York press, right? All this sort of expansionism and this notion. I'm not calling it imperialism here because actually it was not the term used then, right? It was more like expansion, the idea of the U.S. expanding. And so he's going to have a lot to say about it, and we'll talk about it. This is where they quote on the entrails of the monster comes in, right? I have lived in the entrails of the entraña del monster, and I know it well, right? Because he's reading all this, which is, of course, does not bode well for his agenda of sovereignty, right? Because he's seeing this happening, and he's very, very sort of concerned, right? All right, so that is a little bit about any comments on this at all? Are we understanding how this man is, in many ways, a product of where he's living? Yes, sir.
I was struck when you talked about the humanity of materialism. When you looked at the census record who's living in that boarding house with them, one of them is a stockbroker. So he's rubbing shoulders with and the stockbroker in that era didn't carry necessarily the connotation it does for us today. So he's rubbing shoulders. He's not living in a sort of entirely Cuban space,
right,
like you would in Tampa. He's rubbing shoulders with Americans and French and all of these and other immigrants at the same time. We're doing all sorts of occupations. Because New York doesn't have the occupational segregation that some of these other cities have.
And the boarding houses were real places where people mixed. Right? Overall, what I found on the boarding houses is that you could have, when you start doing the census and you look for Cubans and you find where Cubans were living, I have all of those sheets I showed you that have Cubans on them. I never know when things are gonna be online. They're gonna be online forever, so I download them, right, and I print them, right? It's sort of like the Cuban census is now. Whenever they put out a Cuban census online, boom, I download and print because I don't know if somebody from the Central Committee is gonna come in there and say, why is this online? Take that off of it, right?
Yeah.
So you just download it, right? So the same thing with the census is every one of those sheets where a Cuban appears in the 1850, 1860, 1870, 1880 census, I have a copy of it. In a binder, where I know all the I've placed all the Cubans that at least appeared in the census. Right? Why did I get into this? Because of the boarding house thing, right? And you see these arrangements, these boarding house arrangements, right? For example, there's usually the neighborhoods in New York at that time were not really racially segregated, but the boarding houses tended to be racially segregated. Yes, go ahead.
I wasn't able to tell, but did the census record reveal information about race?
Yes, yes.
Because I wasn't able to see it.
Yes, there's an
Because it
annotation
would
for
be interesting
white.
to see, you know,
Yeah.
if it was
Yeah.
black Cubans
Right.
or if they perceived them as black.
Yeah, you also see things like going back to the cigar, not going back, but this is on cigar making communities as well. You can see by the 1880s, when you start getting more Cuban cigar makers in there, you can see a couple of what I call cigar tenement houses.
Mhm.
Cigar tenement houses where one individual who owns a property, right, a large property, usually has families working there, and it's a totally vertically integrated operation. That is, there's sort of the families are working. There's sort of this. It's sort of the urban equivalent of a what is it called, a sharecropper, right? You are producing by the piece you own, and you own a portion of that. And not only that, also there you have the people who are the labelers and everything else, and also the people who sell on the street. And so it's a totally, and cigar tenement house, one of the reasons for the rise of the Cigar Makers International Union was to fight the tenement houses, which were exploited. There weren't too many of those that had Cubans, right? Because those were primarily, of course, the cigar making industry in New York started with Germans, right? But you can see these arrangements, and you see, for example, that where there are some Afro-Cubans living in tenement houses, they usually are all Afro. You know, it's a black tenement house with a lady who's black who runs the tenement house. It was business, I mean, to do that, but it brought people into very close contact with each other, because basically you had, you know, you ate, you had a common place to eat. It was served. It was what was called the board. Right? The board was not only the room but the food. What else? Did anyone else have their hand up somewhere? Yes.
You first.
Yes.
Do we know anything about Marti's Latin American circle? Because this is a place where most Latin
Yes.
American countries have their representative, and there's a lot of press and back and
Right. He actually was. One of his jobs in which he made a living was as a consul. He was a consul for Uruguay, I think, and for Argentina for a while. Right? So he actually functioned as a consul. He does have a La Liga Interamericana and all that, in which he does have a lot of, but I'll show you a graphic later on, in which, although, again, it is true that you had all this contact, and we'll get into that a little bit later. It was a very Cuban place, though. By far the largest number of Latinos in New York about this time were Cubans. Right? And so, but yes, there are any kinds of all kinds of activities like this. But he, well, we're going to get into that. But it was a case of where yes, go ahead. You have your hand up.
I was just wondering about, in terms of modernity in New York and the milieu and social justice and how that extended to class and to race.
Yeah.
Did Marti ever begin to question his own rhetoric of like masculine entitlement to women's labor as an exploitative system? Because like Gilman and Chopin, they hadn't published their big feminist masterworks of the 1890s yet, but that energy was simmering. So was he reacting to things he was seeing in the press about what women's roles should be?
I don't think we can look for in Marti for a lot of that, right? And again, his chronicle on the Brooklyn Bridge is on the proper role of women in supporting their husbands.
And he never nuanced that later, or?
can't think of
As
anything.
far as I know.
No, I cannot think of that. Now, he did talk a lot, again, about social, you know, the exploitation of the worker and so forth. He had a lot, he was very interested in issues of crime and justice. We'll get to that a little bit later because he had that whole series, right? He had that whole series of chronicles on the assassination of Garfield and the trial and imprisonment of Quito, right? In which he's talking about imprisonment and justice, and we'll get to that in a minute because there's an absent chronicle about that. There's a chronicle. Yes.
Yeah, no, just saying, there's an annotation in one of his notebooks in the late '80s where he talks about what are some of the biggest problems that are left unresolved. He doesn't know what he thinks about them, and one of them is suffrage. He writes,
Yeah.
I don't exactly know what to think about suffrage.
Yeah, I don't know.
For Marti to say, I don't know what to think about this is telling.
That's why it's in the notebook. It was never published.
Yeah, I agree with you.
He could
Of all
also
people.
he could also written more on baseball, which is coming up all over the place in New York. But he's not a guy. I just don't see him out there, right? You know, swinging the bat. You know what I'm saying? So there's stuff that we think he might have talked about. Actually, there is a great, you know, in terms of what Marti represents for the Cuban sort of political culture and everything else. There's a great drawing. There's an artist in Cuba, a painter, who does a lot of baseball stuff, right? He draws a lot of baseball characters, things like that. There's one where it's Marti, you know, Marti like in the Kingston, you know, the Kingston photograph, which is his only full body photograph, right? And he's standing there, right? But he's got a chest protector and he's dressed like an umpire.
I agree.
So he's like the umpire, right? You see what I'm saying? It's like, you know, the umpire of what's appropriate in Cuban. Yes.
He had actually, I remember one of his chronicles where he said that he didn't like American women because they were too masculine, too independent, and he actually liked Latin American women because they were more, you know, sweet, feminine, and all that. So there is actually something in there that I distinctively remember because the first time I read it, I was like, okay. So, yeah.
Yes. That's part of the idea of putting him in New York like this, right? Is that he actually was a human being who lived in a city, right? And a man of, perhaps we might say, a man of his time. He might have been ahead of some things, but maybe not on others. Right? And I think his relationship with women was, you know, there's also the interesting Blanche Parral has this also this Blanche Parral, of course, was a woman who lived in New York. She has a memoir of this period, and she remembers Marti. She's the one who wrote about the famous Marti coat, right? Some of you know the story of the coat where he leaves. He goes and says goodbye to the Parral family right before he leaves for Cuba, and he leaves a coat behind, and they only find out later that was his coat, and he had left it in the middle of the winter without his coat. Right, and this was a myth. And then there's been a number of Latin American writers that have written, you know, that movie of The Red Violin, which is a lot of some Latin American writer picked up on that and wrote about Marti's coat. And there was all the people who later had Marti's coat. Right, it was a fiction kind of thing. But Blanche Parral talks about, for example, the fact that she was going to get married to Barat, actually, to Luis Barat, and they were members of the Cuban community there. And Marti wanted to go over and look at her trousseau, right? Right. There is, by the way, a certain feminine side to him in terms of this, a lot of the stuff. And he's sitting there and saying, "Oh, I like that one. Oh, I like this dress. I like that dress. And who does that?" So you know, there are some things about his personality that are, you know. So let me go to. So this is the notion, as I said before, about the milieu and the impact on Marti. Lessons learned, right? What did Marti learn in New York? And this is one that I like to talk about because I think there was some things that he learned about in terms of Cuban immigrant activism. And Cuban New York and its activism preceded by Marti by many decades, right? So I want to go, that's actually most of what I talk about in the book. So I want to go a little bit into that. I start this book in 1823 with the arrival, within a week and independently of each other, of Félix Varela Morales in December of 1823 and José Martí. Right? They are both greeted, by the way, by the same individual, a teenager by the name of Cristobal Mara, right, who's working in a counting house, we'll get to that later, in Lower Manhattan, right, and who knows both of them. He was from a prominent family. And these guys, when they arrive, they go to see Tito Juanito. Tito Juanito puts them up, takes them to a boarding house, right? The reason I start the story there is because of the story of Cuban New York, is because these are recognizable Cubans. And now I'm talking about identity, right? Cubans. I'm sure that there were, many Cubans, persons born in Cuba, who lived in New York much earlier times, right? The Center for Dominican Studies at CUNY has recently published a thing about Juan Gonzalez, who was a, quote, Dominican, who lived in Governor's Island right after Henry Hudson arrived, and who therefore is like the first Latino in New York. I don't know, 1600s, there's a difficulty with the concept of the Dominican in the 1600s, you know what I'm saying, in terms of identity. Just like some friend of mine said, there were any number of Florida governors, Spanish governors of Florida, right, who were born in Cuba. I said, well, that's the concept of a Cuban Spanish governor, right? You know what I'm saying? So these are Cubans. In terms of what they wrote about, in terms of what they did, and so forth, these are recognizable Cubans. But actually, the story of Cuban New York starts way before them, right? Which has to do with why they're there in the first place, or why they arrived there in the first place. Right? And what happens is, of course, there is a sugar revolution that takes place in Cuba, which means it starts about 1780s or so, which is when Cuba goes from small production of sugarcane, sort of a patriarchal journalistic system with few slaves and so forth, to a mass production for a world market. And that is triggered by several things. It's triggered by the loss of Saint-Domingue, right, as the world's largest sugar producer, which increases the prices immediately on the world scale of sugar, right, and that applies to Haiti, right, when Haiti essentially immediately loses its sugar production with the Haitian Revolution. It has to do with the granulation of sugar, which was invented in Louisiana, right, in a pot that was outside in the courtyard outside my office when I was at LSU. John Etienne Borré in 1780-something granulates sugar. That makes it more sellable, not refined, but more sellable on the world market, right? And Cuba, and specifically the criollo, right? The Cuban-born aristocracy in Havana moves in to that border. And they start buying up land, they start producing sugar on a very large scale, right? And of course they start bringing in more slaves. It was a total revolution in terms of Cuba. I mean, Cuba, in a few years, triples practically its population from the population that it had been after 200, some 300 years of Spanish rule. It triples in 1790s, 1800 or so. And that sugar increasingly was sold in New York. Right? It wasn't sold in Spain. It wasn't something that the Spanish controlled. It was something essentially that was sold, that was produced by a Havana aristocracy that farmed all that area around these huge plantations, right, and produced all the sugar. And that sugar was being sold to the U.S., and particularly in New York. New York was the sugar refining center, believe it or not, of the United States. And the earliest refinery was there in the late 1600s. And by the early 19th century, New York had 14 refineries, of which only the last one closed down a few years ago, right? The Domino's was the old Havermeyer sugar refinery in Brooklyn, right? So it was a sugar refining center. The sugar that the Cubans produced, right, was a cake form. It was granulated in a sense, but it was a cake form and needed to be refined. So that sugar was shipped to New York, right, by these criollo aristocrats, who their social class status, their status as a class multiplied immensely, right? They became fabulously rich. They built these mansions, the Aldama Palace, for example, right? The Aldama Alfonso Malan clan was one of the leading ones of these. They had plantations in Havana and in Matanzas, right? And they would ship all of that sugar to New York. In New York, along South Street, right, you had these counting houses that were housed along this area. And the counting houses were financial institutions, essentially, that would take the sugar, right, sell it on consignment for the sugar owners, and then open accounts, right, for those sugar producers in New York. Because these guys wanted their money in New York. right? And would invest in things like bonds, and manage their money. It was the beginning of a banking institution in which they again, and they made, and Isidoro Mala, the guy I mentioned, was working in one of these as an apprentice. So he would learn the business of where his family was selling sugar. And all of this sugar, right, was coming into New York, right? And that established this commercial bridge that not only meant the beginning of what's called the Cuba trade, which is very significant, right? But in addition to that, it was a cultural bridge as well, because then these aristocratic families wanted to educate their children in New York. And one of the things I talk about in the book is at the beginning of the 19th century, that first half of the 19th century, New York really replaces Spain as that other place, right, in the Cuban consciousness, as that place where, people look to where to go, right, where to shop, where to sell stuff, where to, send their children to be educated, right? And the thing, again, going back to research, the thing that's interesting about this is that the largest counting house of them all that existed from about the 1830s until the 1880s was the Moses Taylor and Company. Moses Taylor and Company, founded by Moses Taylor, did most of its wealth, created most of its wealth with the Cuba trade, by taking these shipments from the Cuban producers, right, selling them in New York, keeping accounts for them, and managing everything from their wives' shopping trips to New York, literally, right? Tomás Terry, and the Moses Taylor papers, right? If you can just see the archive of a company, the archive of a company that was around for 60 years or so. Most of the papers are all in the manuscript division of the New York Public Library. You can go in there, right, and see all the exchange of correspondence, right, all the invoices, everything for all of this Cuban sugar. And the fact that Tomás Terry, for example, the great producer of sugar and the great, in Cienfuegos, right, sends his two sons to be educated in New York and places them under the official tutelage of Moses Taylor. And he writes to the Moses Taylor and says, my daughter's getting married. I want you to buy her a necklace with the money I have there, a necklace and earrings and whatever, your choice, and bill it to my account. There was an account for Tomás Terry that I saw in that file for $700,000 right at that time.
Is he the one that built the palace in Cienfuegos?
He has a Teatro Verde. The Teatro Verde. His statue is in front of the theater, by the way. He has a statue when he goes in this front of the theater. And Tomás Terry and like them were Miguel Aldama, right? And so very early in the 19th century, you have this bridge that is established. And that is why when José María Heredia comes in, although he doesn't stay eventually in New York, but he writes to his mother and says, I think I'll stay in New York. It is the closest place to Cuba, right? And the reason it's the closest place to Cuba is because of the ship traffic, right? Because all of this means there's a ship coming and going all the time. So here we have, for example, Robert Albion, right? In his book, which is very important, The Rise of New York Port. Cuba, while still belonging to Spain, became more and more an economic dependency of the United States in general and of New York in particular. And he's talking about this in the early 19th century, okay? The Cuba trade, as it was called, which was sugar and then eventually cigars and tobacco as well as the return, which were all those things that those landowners wanted to buy in linen and in horse and carriages and in things for their mansions and in China, and all things like that, that they wanted to buy. The Cuba trade was third or fourth in this period in the entire trade picture of the United States. Right? If you look at now that, you see, you got to look at that to realize that there is this very early, right? This very early bridge, right, that gets built. Right? Yes, go ahead.
Why does he use the term dependency now?
Dependency because it became dependent, in the same way that we think about Cuba being in the 40s and 50s dependent on the U.S., on the sugar quota and things like that, it became dependent on the trade with the U.S. Right? It was a trade. It was a kind of a dependency on again, it's a classic exportation of agricultural goods in exchange for manufactured goods. Right? And in that file, you find things like, for example, a landowner that says, Sebastián de Peñalver, Marqués de Peñalver was one of the landowners. He says, he writes to Moses Taylor saying, I want a plow with these characteristics, I want a turbine, because what was happening with the sugar thing is that these people were expanding technologically, right? And the sugar plantations became more and more, technologically advanced, right? With particularly steam driven. When once they put steam to drive the rollers, right, to grind the cane, right, they then had a tremendous capacity for producing sugar, right? Then they needed more land. They needed more land, they need more slaves. This is where Cuba goes from a country that has about 25% Afro-Cuban to about 45% Afro-Cuban. Right? Yes?
Are they depending on U.S. creditors then?
Yes,
extend
because-
that? I mean, that's part of where the dependency comes
Yes,
in.
part of the dependency is that they have to go to the banks because one of the things that these counting houses, they were called counting houses, did is the extended credit. Moses Taylor did not. Moses Taylor wanted the trust of these people, so he never got into the business of loaning them money. They had to come up with the money. They had to come up with somewhere else with the money from somewhere else. Or he would actually advance them. He had accounts. He invested money for them. He made money for them, and they had this tremendous trust in this guy. I mean, you could tell. Aldama writes to him and say, put money in this, put money in that. Terry also went into railroads with Moses Taylor. Moses Taylor was one of the founders of Citibank, eventually of City National. Right? So we're talking about the whole move from this trade into sort of, capital, the investment in capital in railroads as well. And there were a lot of Cubans who invested with him on that. Let's see. So here's what I'm talking about. I don't have this in the book. The editor, we don't want graphs. Number of passengers arriving in New York from Cuban ports and from Latin American and Spanish ports. 1821 to 1850 by decade, right? I mean, look, these are Cuban. The passengers arrive from Cuban ports, and the other ones arrive from all Latin American and Spanish ports put together, right? That's incredible in terms of the importance. And here's the result largely of that. This is place of birth. Now I used the Hispanic population, which of course wasn't used then, but I'm talking about all these nationalities that we would from Latin America. And this is the graph from 1850 to 1880. Right? And you see, again, Cuba, Spain, other Latin America, West Indies, and the Cuban percentage number just shoots up. Yeah.
A question. I would have suspected that during the 10 Years' War,
Yes.
that the numbers would go up
Yes.
and they go down.
No, remember the census that's going to enumerate the emigration from the 10 Years' War is the 1870 census. And that's precisely what happened. Because you had this established bridge, right, of money. When the 10-Year War comes in, right, and the criollo aristocracy, right, literally has to choose sides on this. And the Spanish, you know who they are, right? You're with us or against us, There's something intransigencia, that's where we got it from, right? We are not going to sell Cuba, we'd rather have it sink into the ocean, right? The intransigencia on this, right? When you had to sort of declare yourself in this, a lot of this criollo aristocracy actually left. And would they go to Mexico? Would they go to Venezuela? No, they go where their money is. So they go to New York. Right? So I document there this exodus as a result of this, because of that established bridge array. So you've got people like Aldama who've got all their money, liquid assets in New York. They're going to lose their plantations in Cuba. Right? They're going to lose their plantations in Cuba, but their money is in New York. Right? And so this is again, to the Cuba trade, you have to add then the war and literally the exodus. You can take almost all of the people from the criollo aristocracy, the people who were involved with the periódico El Siglo, which was the voice of that criollo aristocracy in the 1870s, in the 1860s. The people from the Junta Información, which was an attempt at reformism, right, in 1868. Again, these criollo aristocrats were trying to fix this, right? They didn't want a war, right? The war was started by whom? By those Easterners. Right? The war started in the East, right? By Easterners who had no particular stake in the continuation of Spanish rule, right? They were horsemen, they were swordsmen, right? And they decided that, unlike, for example, the aristocracy in Havana, which usually never left their palaces or the sugar plantation, these guys in the East, you know, they knew fencing, they knew swordsmanship, they were horse riders, and they could lead an armed rebellion, right? But the ones in Havana got stuck in this, right? And it was either you were with the Spanish or against them. And there's a great letter from Miguel Aldama, right, who was probably the most important of all these in Havana, this Havana aristocracy, where he's offered the position of civil governor of Cuba, responding to the military governor as a kind of addressing once the war breaks out. And Aldama writes, it's like too late, man. We've been saying this for a long time. We've been saying you need to reform the colonial regime. We've been saying you're just too hard-nosed on this, right? And now, these guys out in the East, we don't know, but they decided that this had to be solved with bullets. So now what are we going to do? Well, I'm going to New York. I'm going to New York because part of the Aldama Palace was actually burned down by the volunteers, right? When Spain says, okay, you know, you guys want war, let's have war. And the Cubans became indistinguishable in that sense. Aldama or any of the Easterners. And these guys had to leave. And just about, and I have in the book, again from the census, every one of those Criollo aristocrats in the 1870 census, where they lived, right? Aldama lived what's now the Diamond District on 47th Street, right? And yes, go ahead.
Coupled with what you're saying,
Yep.
they sent their children to get educated in New York.
Yes.
And the University of Troy becomes very, very important.
Yes. And a lot of, not only was that for university degrees, and this is all, I have a section in the book about this, because you can imagine Moses Taylor and his financial firm having to meet these kids, because a lot of them were actually, you know, teenagers who were going for secondary schools, having to meet these kids, right, on the docks in New York, buying them winter clothes, setting them up in a boarding school in New Jersey or in upstate New York or someplace like that, right? And then having to give them an allowance. There's an entire packet of correspondence between these kids and Moses Taylor. I don't like it here. I want to go home. Imagine, these are kids of privilege, right? Who suddenly get tossed into this cold place where they don't understand the language. Right? And it was a trouble. And that's what I'm talking about, this rate. One estimate is that by 1850, about 5,000 Cuban children had already been educated in the United States. And included Fordham as well, yes.
And playing baseball.
And playing baseball, right? That's where the, you see this has all kinds of aristas, right? It has all kinds of, you know, going out. Because you can also talk about baseball in that country, the Young brothers and all those people, and you know, and Fordham was very important also in this. It was called St. John's at that time, right? And there's correspondence there, and they're having to deal with them, and the headmaster saying, I want this kid out of here, he's nothing but trouble, and then Moses Taylor has to find another place, right, or send him back to Cuba, or whatever, right, yes?
Yeah, Lisandro, you mentioned in your book that your statistics there may not be reflective of what was going on, because many Cubans may have identified themselves as Spaniards instead of Cubans,
right.
So the numbers may actually have been greater.
Yes. There was, for example, and again, I like to get to the microcosm. There was a family called the Sedano family that had been in Cuba for 4 generations, right? But they identified as Spanish. And when the war breaks out, right, they leave and they say, no, we're going back to Spain. And they went through New York. So they would have been included in the passenger list, but not as Cubans, right?
Of course.
Right? And it's hard at this point to talk about who's Cuban and who's not Cuban, right? So those are some of the figures on that. Here's an interesting, there's a guy named, talking about Latin American writers, there's an individual by the name of Simón Camacho, who's a chronicler of stuff that happens in New York, particularly among Latin Americans, right? And Camacho is a Venezuelan, right, who lives in New York, and he writes a lot about, you know, stuff going on in New York, which I wish Marti had done. See, Marti fails me. As somebody who studies the Cuban community in New York, Marti, with all these chronicles and all these escenas, he doesn't really write about the Cuban community, right? Right? He fails me as somebody who might be a source for what I'm looking for. But Camacho writes some things about the Cuban community. Here's something he says. In Cuba, as far as I know, is where you can find the largest number of Cubans. But besides Cuba, nowhere else are there more Cubans than on the docks of the Columbia or the Marion on sailing day. Someone said that Piers of New York was a neighborhood of the land, and I could not disagree. 1864.
Wow.
Right? 1864. Notice also, you know, New York is a neighborhood of
Yeah.
that, right? Because I haven't looked at the figures, but it may be that at this point New York is actually smaller than Quebec. Maybe. Yeah,
I
right.
was just gonna say, following up on a question you had, the Recovery Project in Houston has 2 novels that they recovered by 2 individuals who also wrote around this time. One of them is called Lucas Guevara, the novel. He's from Colombia, and then there's La Factoría by Gustavo Alemán Bolaños.
Yeah.
And they're available digitally.
Yeah. Camacho also has something I have in the book, which is something I didn't talk about. Imagine, I'm trying to put here sort of this history before Marti, which is what the book is about, so I'm leaving out a lot of stuff, right? But also because of this early sugar trade, Cubans became known in New York as a wealthy group, right? With a whiff of old world aristocracy. Right? And there's a famous wedding in 1858, before the Gilded Age, that shocked New Yorkers because of the just excessive consumption. Right? I mean, it was just a wedding, and the guy was, his name was Esteban Santa Cruz, and he owned a plantation in Cuba, and he was actually a president. He was not an absentee owner. He was there, right? And he married this young American woman. Right? By this time, he's 56. Right? He marries a young American woman. It was news in all the New York newspapers. It was in all the New York newspapers, right? And the New Yorkers were shocked at the degree of spending on this wedding, right? Mm-hmm. By the way, later on I discovered that this guy, he had never married before, but there's a book by Marta Rojas, right, in Cuba called El Harén de Oviedo. That's because Oviedo actually had, essentially, in his plantation in Cuba, a harem of slave women, right, with whom he had 26 children.
The same guy.
The same guy. Right? So anyway, all these interconnections, right? Somebody pops up somewhere, right? And then you see Simón Camacho wrote about that wedding. I'll get to you in a minute, but let me finish this thought. Simón Camacho wrote about that wedding. Then later on, I'm reading this book about the assassination of Garfield, years later in the 1880s, right? And who's the first guy that grabs Guiteau? A Venezuelan who lives in Washington named Simón Camacho. Right? And I read that and I went, whoa, that's my Simón Camacho, right? From back in 1860. Go ahead, sir.
It's interesting that you're saying this flood of Cubans coming to New York. My country is in the middle of a civil war between 1860 and 1865. Apparently the Cubans are not concerned by sending their families and their wealth and their children to study in this country.
But keep in mind that this actually, the war breaks out in 1868, and the high period of this migration is between January and April of 1869.
Yeah, but look at that quote by the Venezuelan. Look at the year.
Are you referring to the American Civil War?
The American Civil War.
Yeah, the U.S. Civil War.
By the way, another connection with the Civil War is that the model for the counting houses, that is the model of taking sugar, right? Taking sugar and reselling it in New York Commission. That was the model also of the cotton plantations, right? And that is why New York was so hesitant in many ways on the entry into the Civil War, because there was the cotton trade that went through New York, right? And it was the same thing with slave owners, right? There was a lot of interest in New York. I mean, John L. O'Sullivan, right? Who was the first one to use the term manifest destiny, was actually a New York Democrat who was an expansionist and a pro-slaver, right? And by the way, he was the brother-in-law of Cristobal Mahler, whom I mentioned earlier, as being the guy the teenager who received Heredia, and you see this connection. I mean, you got to look at the micro-history of this, right? You know, go ahead, you see what? So yes, this was happening during the Civil War, but you know. New York was almost a separate world in many ways. I mean, these people were, Aldama and these people were vacationing in Saratoga.
Yes.
Vacationing in Saratoga. And this is what the image of the Cubans, right? The image of the Cubans, what time do I have? The image, yeah. The image of the Cubans as being wealthy. Let me see if I find a little on Saratoga, particularly the New York Herald had this tremendous quote, right? The New York Herald had a story in Saratoga, the New York Tribune, excuse me, right? Here, this is 1866, okay? Here, as everywhere in Saratoga, one notices the great number of Cubans, right? These Cubans with their yellow-brown complexions, their slumberous eyes, and old sad faces would seem out of place at revels if the glitter of their unnumbered jewels and their life-swaying, passionate dancing did not contradict the promise of their somber presence. There are two sisters at the ball in robes of yellow gossamer with scarlet blossoms in their black hair, and on their tiny feet slippers of scarlet satin smaller than Cinderella's. Flashing down the hall in the gallop, these gorgeous creatures look like the incarnate tropics. All right? And Simón Camacho adds to that, right? In a sense on that, he says, all of Saratoga is now Cuban. 18, I mean, from time to establish, you see, that there is this long history here before Marti. And then this community, right, we haven't really talked about the political activism yet, right? Because you've got now a large community. You've got the largest Latino community in the Northeast, right, at this time, right? And so let's look a little bit at the political activism. Sorry. So Cuban émigré activism. First of all, led by elites. That was not what Marti sort of did, right? Marti did the movement from the ground up, right? But all of this was led by the elites, right? We'll see. The very first really organized movements of political activism in New York are annexationists. And the annexationists who want annexation of the U.S. are elites. It's in their interest to become annexed to the U.S., right? So we'll see that in a minute. Principal currents, reformism, reformism, that's why I have the phone up, so they're going to think of it. I don't know how to silence. Right? Principal currents, reformism and autonomism. This was always present, right? People who said, well, maybe we can strike a deal with the Spanish to either reform how they rule Cuba or give us a measure of autonomy so we can rule ourselves, right? These were the reformists and the autonomists. Many of these, of the criollo aristocracy, were reformists, right? Because they really didn't want a war where they might lose their, where they might have their properties devastated, right? Then you got the annexationists, right? You have the annexationists, who again, in the 1848, 1849, 1850, 51, in that period, was the leading current, right? Cristobal Almada, who I mentioned before, right, was one of those. Many of the sugar aristocracy wanted that because they had concluded already they could not keep up, they had to abolish the slave trade, but continue, of course, slavery. And the U.S. was a model of that. The U.S. had much earlier ended, right, the slave trade, but kept slavery. So this was a model, and more slavery is under attack, right? The British and the Spanish at this time were sort of, had weak knees on this, right? And so they figured our best chance is to join the American Union, right? And they formed an entire group in New York, right? This was something very much based in New York, right? Narciso Lopez and the expeditions of Narciso Lopez, who was someone who went to Cuba, he was Venezuela, and he led an armed expedition made up largely of non-Cubans, by the way, right? Who were paid by these sugar landowners to go to Cuba and try to wrestle Cuba from Spanish control and add it as a state. This with the armed expeditions gone and with the failure of the U.S. to negotiate a deal to buy Cuba, which was part of the annexionist deal, which was try to see if the U.S. would buy Cuba, right? Without failure, the annexationist movement actually declined after that. Besides, once it got really enmeshed in the North-South conflict, none of the northern states were going to vote for the admission of the slaves. Right? So that sort of went out. But it was the beginning of an organized exile, Cuban émigré activism. And then, of course, independence. Right? Largely when the annexationist movement fails, right? And people start talking then about independence. The thing about reformism, autonomism, annexationism is it could be done peacefully. Right? But independence was going to be done violently. Right? That was not something the Spanish would have agreed to. Right? So how did we go about this? I'll get back to the annexationists in a minute. Principal activities. Well, they were seeking reforms from Madrid. They went to Madrid, right, in the Junta de Formación, and they said, "What? Can we get a better deal here, right, in terms of, how you govern Cuba instead of, as a military camp, which it was." The head Spanish administrative authority in Cuba was a captain general, right, Capitán General, right. Financing and organizing military activity. This was the principal sort of activity. The idea was to get money together, fund a purchase of arms and everything else that's happened during the annexationist period. It happened during the 10-year war, right, where they were raising money. The purpose of the émigré community was to raise money, fill a ship with guns and men of any nationality. If you had to buy guns, you could also buy the men, right? And again, these guys like Aldama and these sugar owners were not about to get in the boat and go to Cuba. You see what I'm saying? So, fund expeditions, send them on their way. Usually, sometimes they fail because they spent all the money on the guns and not on the ship. And the ship would, sometimes, run aground somewhere and stuff like that, right? And, very important, lobbying the U.S. government for support. Of course, the annexationists were, the best example is because they were lobbying the U.S. government to have Cuba annexed, but also Céspedes, Carlos Manuel de Céspedes, who of course was the head of the Cuban government during the war, the 10-year war, the one who started the war, Carlos Manuel de Céspedes, sent a delegation, had a representation in New York, right, that was led by Aldama and all the sugar people, right? And they were supposed to lobby the U.S. for support of the Cuban insurgency. Right? So this was the core of these activities, right? Whatever. Let me do a side note here on the annexationists. The Cuban flag is an annexationist flag, right? It was conceived in New York in 1850, right? In a boarding house. It was sewn by a Cuban woman by the name of Emilia Teurbe Torón. Her husband was a poet. His name was Teurbe Torón because she was actually his cousin, his first cousin. Miguel Teurbe Torón, yes. And it flew for the first time ever, right, outside of the offices of the New York Sun, the newspaper that gave money for this cause. And on Nassau and Fulton Streets is where the Sun used to be, and that's where the first time where it flew. I said, well, there's got to be coverage of that in the Sun, right? So let me go and see if I can see it, right? Coverage. So I go to the New York Public Library, microfilm room, the newspapers, right? The roll for that year is missing, right? So I go to the New York Historical Society, right? And I see that they also have it, appear to have it. I request it, I take my chair next to the microfilm machine, and out comes the guy with the newspaper. Right? With white gloves, right? And so I took the picture. This must be the first published printed depiction of the Cuban flag.
What year we're talking about?
1850, May 1850.
Was Charles Dana
Yes.
already heading up the Sun?
Yes.
Yes. Well, he was, let's see, Charles Dana was later in the Sun, but he was a supporter of this. He was a little bit later. The guy in the Sun at that time was a guy by the name of Moses Yale Beach, was his name, who was the head of the Sun, right, at this time. So again, there's this sort of, well-worn path, right? Marti comes in 1880 into a long history. That's what I'm trying to say, right here. He comes into a really long, and by the way, the irony is that this remains the Cuban flag, right? Even though the independence movement, there was actually a debate about this at the Constitution Convention in 1868, when Céspedes, of course, was going to form the government for the war, and there's a question of the flag. Céspedes had his own flag, which kind of looked like the Chilean flag. You know, it was a red, white, and blue. Again, they were all Lone Star. They were all Lone Star flags, interestingly enough. But the assembly finally, the Camagüeyanos particularly, right, Agramonte and them, were the ones that argued for this has a history, this flag has a history, right? And so they went with this flag. But it is an annexationist flag. It is an annexationist flag. It is a Cuban flag to this day. So, given this whole history, which I've only given you, I wish I could say more here and there about this history, right? And give you some more examples of it. Given this long history of activism and everything else, what was it that Marti learned? Okay, specifically, the experiences and lessons. He arrives in New York in 1880, right? The first thing he's doing is he's organizing the Garcia expedition of the Guerra Chiquita, right? Calixto Garcia is one of the legendary figures of the 10-year war, right? The war ended with him when he's surrounded by the Spanish troops. He puts a gun under his chin, right, and fires into his head. The bullet goes out the forehead, right, and he recovers. All right? And survives to fight another day, right? So in 1880, he's, by the way, living in New York. His family, throughout all of this period, in which he's fighting in Cuba, even up to 1895, he was living in New York. First on 45th Street, I can show you the census. The census document of him and his family living in 1880 in New York. And then later on, they live in Harlem, on Lenox Avenue in Harlem, okay? So Garcia, the expedition. So Marti puts all his effort into this expedition, right? Raising money, making speeches, everything else. It's in 1880, the first year he's in New York. And of course, this is the typical model. You arm an expedition, you send it on its way, and then hope for something to happen, right? And that maybe something will happen, and then maybe someone will form a government. I mean, I don't know. There's no, clear objective to this, right? Of course, the Garcia expedition and the resulting war, La Guerra Chiquita, as it was called, fails. And again, Marti learned the lesson. It's not enough to do this. This isn't just about sending an expedition on its way, right, to see what happens. You've got to have a movement. You've got to have a program. You've got to have some goals. You've got to have, what's this about? This isn't just about sending this expedition on its way. And this had been the model, by the way, of the War of 1868, of what the émigrés did on the expedition. José María Mora was one of the Cuban, I have a lot of him in the book, he was one of those Cuban New Yorkers who gave a lot of money, right? Back in 1870, 1871 to these expeditions. The last one was for his brother-in-law, Domingo Iguria, right? And Domingo Iguria dies, right? And this, he's executed, right? And he was out of money. José María Mora was out of money, right? His son, by the way, became an important photographer later in New York. I try to follow his family. So they're all buried in Greenwood, by the way, part of my tour. And he's a photographer, and later he has the picture of Marti that I showed with the little sort of boutonniere here, that one that had, is by Mora. There's a picture of Chester Arthur. He has a picture of William Cullen Bryant. You occasionally find in flea markets in New York his photographs, signed Mora. Right? And he ended up being a theatrical photographer, right, for the covers of the Metropolitan Operas and stuff like that. Anyway, what am I saying? So anyway, José María Mora, for example, gave money for this and whatever, ran out of money, right? So, I mean, Marti said, this isn't good. Okay. The next thing he learned from him, this was a big lesson, all right? We were talking about it. The meeting with Gómez and Maceo in 1884. Anybody know about that? The meeting with Gómez and Maceo in 1884. Este fue el desencuentro. Or as my British colleague says, the row. Right? The row we had with Gómez and Maceo. Right? Go ahead.
Wasn't there a letter written afterwards?
Yes, he wrote a letter. A nation is not founded, General, on from a military campaign.
Yes.
Right? Because what happens here? Gómez and Maceo, right? Let me tell the whole story. And let me go ahead because I should have a. Yeah, no, wait, I go back. That's where it takes place. The meeting takes place at the Hotel Griffou of Madame Griffou, on 21 West 9th Street. That's behind Washington Square Park, right? Madame Grifou was a French woman who had a Cuban son-in-law, because she had lived in Cuba. And whenever Maceo, in the 1870s, would go to New York, he'd stay at Madame Grifou's because, of course, Madame Grifou was not thinking about the race of her boarders, right? Whereas many of the Midtown hotels probably were. So Maceo would stay with Madame Grifou. When the generals go in October of 1884, they go to New York, and again, the 10-year war is over, right? They're thinking they're going to get something going. Let's get the band back together, right, on this. They have been promised $100,000 from Félix Varela, who is probably the richest man in New York at this point, who invested a lot of his money in Manhattan real estate. And that's another story, which I won't get into, right? But there's a lot of documentation on his wealth because he had a nasty will contestation after he died. So anyway, Gouin promises his money. The generals arrive in New York, right? They stay at Madame Grifou's, right? And Gouin does not show up. The money he promised and the money he promised to raise money, never showed up. One of Marti's biographers, NEH, says that Gouin probably was trying to leverage the Spanish to return to him some of his properties in Cuba for the promise of not giving money to another expedition. Or as NEH says, he played with two cards, right? But anyway, he didn't show up, right? Gomez is frustrated. He's in New York. He's wondering what's here. He was comfortable in Central America, whatever. And he's now, nevertheless, organizing. Again, they got small contributions from Cubans, working class Cubans in New York in 1884. And they have a whole scheme. These are generals, right, with experience in the conflict, right, and the 10-year war. These are veterans of the 10-year war in the battlefields of Cuba for 10 years. So they include Marti in their plans. Marti is to go to Mexico with Maceo and raise money with him. Marti requests a meeting with him in October of 1884. The date, anyway, it doesn't matter. The 18th, is that right? I have it up there. Do I have it up there?
On the next slide.
On the next slide. October 18th. It's a Saturday. And Marti goes there. He's 30 years old by this time, right? And he sits in front of the general, whatever, and Gomez goes over the plans. You know, we're going to do this, and we're going to do this. Marti says, General, let me suggest this. Bam, 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 and Marti starts giving him suggestions as to how he should run his military campaign. Right? And Gomez is looking at him like, this 30-year-old poet, right, is sitting there, right, telling me how to run what is a military campaign, right? I mean, Gomez is an old, he's an old general, right? And he wrote later, he allowed himself to make unsolicited suggestions to me, right? And after a while, Gomez, who has a bath waiting for him, right, says, look, Marti, don't worry about yourself with these details. Just go to Mexico with Maceo, and he will tell you what to do. And he goes to take his bath. Marti is like, and Maceo's like, the old man, he's used to giving orders, he's trying to, and he finally, when Gomez comes back from his bath, he takes his leave and leaves. Maceo turns to him. There's two eyewitnesses to this meeting. And Gomez turns to him. Maceo turns to him and says, General, that man leaves here very upset with us. Upset was not the word, right? He probably had to run around Washington Square a couple of times, right? And then he writes the letter, right? That says, he rejected Gomez's authoritarianism.
Military.
Right? His authoritarianism, he's a military guy, and he says, you can't found a nation. You might run a military campaign like that, but this is about founding a nation, right? And you can't run this out of a military camp, right? Gomez would later write that what happened was that Marti wanted to be a protagonist here, and he wasn't going to allow him to do that, right? Because, who's Marti? That's a poet. So, let me go back to where I was, right? So, in this meeting, he learns, first of all, the importance of having a civilian movement, right? Not a military movement, right? The military would be part of the civilian movement, but it would not be a military movement. A broad-based, inclusive, democratic movement, and the idea also that elites are cautious, right? Elites don't give money, right? elites, if they see an opportunity to make money in something or whatever, they will and not give you the money, right? Elites are cash, you can't depend on them. Now that experience is critical, obviously. So when it comes to establishing the PRC, right? And this happens in 1884. The other thing that he learns is that the U.S. government and the New York press, from the U.S. government and the New York press, is that it is not in the best interest of Cuban sovereignty to call attention in the U.S. to the Cuban cause, right? So, I mean, this is like, you know, part of what he learns from what he's reading in the newspaper, right? He's seeing all this expansionism and everything, and he explicitly rejects what every other Cuban exile or emigre activist had done, from Céspedes, Morales Lemus, Francisco Vicente Aguilera, the annexationists, whatever, which is lobby the U.S., give press conferences in New York, right, about this or that or the other. This is why he says, right, in his last letter to in his camp before he's killed, en silencio ha tenido que ser. In silence it had to be, right? We don't want the U.S. interested in this, right? We don't, and this, to me, this is what I think was an incredible amount of foresight, right, on the part of Marti, right? Because essentially, right, he applied those lessons in capturing this movement, thereby breaking the traditional mold of exile activism. And not only that, he breaks that mold, right, and it's going to come together again later, right, with the PRC later and even into the 20th century. Right? Because I haven't talked about parallels between, for example, Cuban emigre activism now, right, and this whole thing, which is again to interest the U.S. in this, right? This lobby effort, this whatever, no good, right? So, what does the PRC look like, right? Democratic, broad-based and inclusive, at least on paper, racially, socially, class, geography, civilian-led, well-articulated principles, right? That's the thing that he saw missing in all his other experiences. Did not include a lobbying of public relations. He didn't have a guy in charge of public. He didn't have really Horatio Rubens going out there, right, and doing all this stuff that later would happen, right? And of course, later on we know, right, that this was something that essentially was not followed, and it's a historically unique to an immigrant world. Not followed before or since, right? The idea of especially keeping the U.S. out of, right, out of, you know, an interest in Cuba. And of course, what happens later on, and Jerry Boyle has quite a bit of this, is what happens after Marti dies. The PRC is taken over by Estrada Palma, Gonzalo de Quesada. These are men who are going to be inclined to favor, right, an intense lobbying effort, right, with the U.S. Because in many ways, as Jerry says, right, they were much more interested in creating an acceptable republic rather one that would be broad-based racially, right? These were, after all, elites, right? And they didn't want this whole revolutionary type of movement, right? And that's one of the reasons that Puerto Ricans separate from there, right? Why Sotero Figueroa and all them say, you know, right? That's not where we're going with this. And there was Serra as well, Rafael Serra, right, who also says this is not what Marti, you know, this is all in New York. This is not what Marti was talking about. Okay, and there is this conflict because if you take Rafael Serra, who's a black man, cigar worker in New York, and you're telling him, right, that you know you're going to put your stake in the U.S., right, which at the time had the kind of racial kinds of dynamics. So I mean, certainly that had the right. You're saying, right? That's not what we're looking at. Right? That's when Sotero and most people also Puerto Rican say, we're out of here. Yeah.
So would you include in that was self-funded as well? And a related question is, who are they going to raise money from in Mexico?
In Mexico, sort of, I don't know. Well, actually, Marti had quite a bit of success with the local clubs in raising money, and he had those everywhere. Right? I mean, the local clubs were a huge network that was the basis of the PRC, and the local clubs would actually send money, right, to this, right? So it was self-funded. You're right. Maybe we should put self-funded there. You're absolutely right. But I think he was able to raise a significant amount of money from the various local groups. This is where Marti By the way, we don't have any evidence, and maybe someone can come up with it, that between 1880 and 1891, Marti left the tri-state area in New York. In 1891 is when he stops writing the Escenas Norteamericanas, he starts fooling around, he starts, in many ways, devoting less attention to all this literary stuff and all that kind of stuff, and he says, no, aquí, and he has a speech in Harman Hall, right? We're now going to get on our horses, right? And that's when he starts the whole thing. That's when he starts traveling, right? And he comes to Key West, and he comes to Tampa and all that, right? Yes.
It occurs to me, the question about Mexico, and in the novel Juan Criollo, which was written in the very early 20th century, the Cubans who were dissatisfied with the end of the 10-year war, or who didn't want to fight, many of them went to Yucatan. And there were cigar factories there. And in that novel, the protagonist goes back to Cuba in 1895. But it occurs to me that there were probably quite a number of Cubans there, not in Mexico City, but in Yucatan. In Mérida, yeah.
Well, yes, and there were, he wasn't depending upon the money of wealth of Cubans, but the legend, and I haven't been able to verify if this is true or not. Remember that in December of 1894, there was Andina, right? The whole expedition where he's put all his money and the ships and the arms and everything else is intercepted by the U.S. and the Pinkertons and everything else off Fernandina Beach here in Florida, right? And he loses all those resources, right? And he's like crazy, right? He's got a lawyer going to court to see if they can recover some of that from the U.S. government. But the legend, and I don't know if this is true, is that the person who steps up, and we talked about this, and maybe there's something that to be researched, the person who steps up and gives him $100,000, well, that's a lot of money, was the daughter of Félix Varela, who had reneged in 1884 on that same pledge to Gómez and Maceo. Maybe it's a I don't know, but they're all in Greenwood Cemetery.
Who gave the 100,000?
Luciana Gobin, she was the oldest daughter of Felix Gobin, who was the oldest, who was the richest man in New York. He had died by this time, right? And she had inherited the money in a protracted trial over his will, and she inherited most of that. At one time, Felix Gobin in 1890 or so owned 26 row houses in what is now Hell's Kitchen, all of them with families paying rent, right?
Yeah, it wouldn't be the first time. I mean, if you go back in history, during the Revolutionary War here, when the troops were abandoning Washington, he got money for the decisive battles that turned the revolution for the Americans from Las Damas de La Habana, who were Spanish, obviously, at that time. But somebody was sent to see the Captain General, and he said, no, we can't help you, but his wife got money from jewels and all this from the women, the elite women in Havana. So it would be the first time there was that intervention.
So, yeah, but you're right, I think self-funded is a good one instead of getting money.
Yeah, right.
Yes?
Is Fernandina just another kind of expedition that was rejected?
Well, yes, but keep in mind that at some point there had to be an expedition. That is, at some point the war had to go to Cuba.
Yeah.
But now it's part of the generals report, right, to the party, right? He recruits the generals, right? When he tries to woo Marti, Maceo Gómez back, right? He takes him to Barnum's, right? And everything. He gets the military people on board, but always they report to the PRC. So first of all, he's created a civilian movement with written principles, bases, and everything, right? And he's recruited the generals to be part of that, right? And there's coordinated expeditions coming from different parts, presumably. So yes, ultimately, there's got to be an expedition, but it's not just, let's send it on its way and see what happens.
Okay.
And of course, Marti goes on this, right? Or he gets killed. All right, so we may have time for bonus content. Can we do bonus content?
Yeah.
Yes, all right. So, the missing chronicles. Yes. This is what I call La Crónica Ausentes. Because, keep in mind again, Marti did not, right? Marti was not a reporter. When I was at the Coleman Center for Scholars and Writers, I had the privilege of being in the New York Public Library doing research on this. I was in the company of scholars and writers who knew nothing about Marti, right? And I circulated to them my first draft of the Marti chapter to see what they thought. And some of them thought, this guy, is this guy like a stringer? You know what I'm saying? Like a newspaper, like he's a representative of La Nación or whatever, and he's supposed to send back reports, right? I think it's important to keep in mind that in all of this, right, Marti is not a reporter, right? If Susanna Rutgers' book, for example, on the exceptional gaze of Marti, right, is the idea that Marti, right, is not reporting as a reporter would to La Nación or to Partido Liberal or any of these newspapers, right? He is sending this with reflections that have a message for the Latin American reader, right? And we have to keep that in mind because in many ways, if he were a reporter, there were things he should have written about that he didn't. And that's maybe the explanation why he didn't write about some things. But just keep in mind that his source are the New York newspapers. If you take some of his chronicles and match them up with the newspapers in New York, right, that he's reading, and the wealth of newspapers, the Herald and the Tribune and the Times and the Post and all of those, right, you see what Marti is reading and what he's writing. You can actually match those up.
He's interpreting.
Right? So he's interpreting. He has a message here. And maybe we could say he doesn't have some chronicles because they were not part of the message. Right? They were not part of the message. So the case I want to talk about, right, is the case, an example of a missing chronicle. To me, the most egregious one, again, I wish Marti had written about this, right, is the case of Miguel Chacón. Okay? 1884 to 1886. This is a case of crime and punishment. Okay? So, Chacón is a 20-year-old black Cuban cigar roller, okay, in New York. He is arrested on October, do I have the date somewhere? On the 21st of June of 1884, and he's arraigned at the Jefferson Market Courthouse on 6th Avenue on that date, accused of the murder of Maria Williams, who was described by the Tribune as a pretty colored woman. Right? Maria Williams, it was a triangular situation, right? Chacón was the lover. He lived in her boarding house, and apparently they became close because Maria's husband, who was sort of estranged, right, worked somewhere else. He went to Pennsylvania and other places to work, whatever, and in that absence, Maria and Miguel, fell in love, whatever, had a relationship. He even invested in the boarding house, bought some furniture and everything else, right, etc. The husband one day comes back, right, and there's a confrontation at the boarding house. It's on 27th Street and 6th Avenue. Right? There's a confrontation at the boarding house, right? They scuffle. Miguel leaves, comes back with a gun, fights with the husband some more. A bullet is fired from his gun, and it goes right through Maria's heart. Maria's heart. Yeah, she was standing about, and she died instantly. Right? So there is a trial, right? And Chacón is charged with first-degree murder because they said it was premeditated because he took a gun. Right? Right? Now people said, well, he didn't intend to shoot her. He was just a scuffle, and maybe it wasn't first degree. The district attorney prevailed on that. They accused him of first-degree murder. Right? They found him guilty. Right? I have the whole transcript of the trial, which was really, really interesting because what develops is the notion that the husband was really uncaring. Right? The husband was like, he didn't really care about her or anything like that. He had been estranged from her and so forth, but probably came back because the business of the boarding house was good and so forth. Right? Whereas Miguel was contrite. Right? There's a point in which, and he's speaking to a translator, right? And there's a point at which the district attorney says, but you intended to go there and kill Maria Williams. Says, oh no, he says, I loved her. There's this pathos involved. And the New York press starts getting behind him, right? Especially since he is, in fact, found guilty and sentenced to death, right? And the Tombs. The Tombs was, at that time, the prison in New York City, the municipal prison. It's now another building in the downtown area of the criminal courts, right? And it's called the Tombs because of the Egyptian motif. See in the colors, right? And he's in the tombs, and the press is following this, right? Because he's got an appeal. They go to the governor, the citizens get behind this. And this is a big story in the New York newspapers. You go to the newspapers of this period, and just about all of them, right? All of the newspapers, the major newspapers, have a story on Chekhov. He tries to kill himself at some point in the prison, right? And that's featured on there, right? The appeals go nowhere, right? The governor does not want to rescind the execution, and 2 years after the crime, he is hanged in the courtyard of tombs, right? And there is, leading up to this, the visit by the priest, the whatever, the remorse, the warden saying, I am not looking forward to building the scaffolding, right, for the execution. This is a model prisoner. They kind of get behind whatever. And finally, he's executed. His uncle comes around and claims the body. He doesn't have a place to bury it. I mean, this is the story that, in terms of the human interest, I'm trying to make the point that the press really followed. This isn't the front page. There were 19 media in the hanging of Chekhov. And it was in the front page of almost every newspaper in New York City. These are the newspapers in this period that are going before Marti's eyes. Right? Now. Right? Now. He writes absolutely nothing, right, about this compatriot, right, that has been accused of murder, sentenced, at the same time that he's writing, by the way, about the whole process of Guiteau in a jail, right, the assassin of Garfield, right, about his prison and this and that and whatever, nothing. This is a missing crime, right? But why is he missing, right? Right? It's not part of what he wants to transmit. The crime, the execution of a Cuban in New York, and I might add especially, right, a black Cuban in New York, right? No le conviene. It's not what he's writing about. This is not what he wants to communicate to a reader in Buenos Aires, right? And so this is why Marti fails me, right? Because I would love to get Marti to tell me something about Chacón, right? And all these people, and tell me who that guy was. There was a Cuban guy that I haven't been able to identify, who went to the governor, right, to ask for, to the sentence to be commuted to a life in prison, whatever. Now, right? And it's not in there. It's a missing chronicle. Yes?
But of course he does later write the town sets the black man on fire.
The what?
He later, in the 1890s, he writes the town sets the black man on fire about, about the famous case in Texas, right? Like he does write about that black man.
Yes, he does write about that, but not about a Cuban, right?
Yeah.
Right? Yeah.
That also raises a couple of questions about him as consul, because how is Miguel Chacón identified as? Is he Cuban? In his Spanish, is the diplomatic Spanish authorities stepping in to protect his rights?
Right.
And at the same time, this time period in places like Texas, the Southwest, this is common.
Yeah.
These cases are all over the place. And there we see, the press and the consuls, Mexican consuls, and Mexicans themselves coming to terms with, oh, wait a minute, I think I'm Mexican now, so I need help here.
Yeah.
So it's an interesting dynamic.
I guess my only point about it is not that this is an uncommon case.
No.
But what I'm saying is, it's that Marti did not see it like he should write about it, right? Because that he was aware of it, right? There's no question about it, right? I mean, this were the newspapers that from which he nurtured himself for all these chronicles he's writing, and yet this is the front page. It involves a Cuban, and nothing. It's interesting what you were saying about the consular. Let me give you one little anecdote that showed how interrelated Cuba and New York were. And this was about 1880, and it did involve the Spanish consuls. One of the businesses that Cuban New Yorkers had was selling Havana lottery tickets in New York. This is something we're familiar with, right? They're no foreign lotteries, right? Okay, so the Havana, this is a bonus content as well, right? But the story surfaced in the newspaper that there had been a Spanish man, turned out to be Cuban, Spanish man who had been kidnapped from the corner of Lafayette and I don't know what street it was. He had been kidnapped, right? And that this man was in possession of Havana lottery tickets of a red color. The press sort of said, and when his associates put out the story, they said, these are Havana lottery tickets, and they kidnapped him probably to steal his Havana lottery tickets, right? So the story takes on different kinds of, the story starts morphing, right, in the newspaper, right? Until it's determined that this guy had not been kidnapped at all, but somebody identified him. The Spanish consul gets involved. He says, okay, this is a Spanish whatever citizen, and I'm going to get involved in this. And he starts making his own, and they put up a reward. If somebody has seen or heard of this man, whatever. Finally, a guy who runs a boarding house in downtown says, hey, that guy's been here all along. He's never left. Right? It turns out that the whole thing was a scheme to publicize that this guy had presumably legitimate lottery tickets, because part of what happened was that a lot of people were counterfeiting the Havana lottery tickets. So if somebody kidnaps a guy to steal his lottery tickets, it's because those lottery tickets have to be legitimate. It was all a scheme, right? To attest to the legitimacy of the Havana lottery tickets. And the New York Times comes back with that and says, in the future, when everybody realizes they've been scammed, and the guys are back in Cuba after having solved the legitimate lottery tickets, right? The New York Times says, in the future, the city, nor the Spanish consul, nor the police department should interest themselves in the affairs of any Spanish or Cuban person who is presumably abducted in the streets of New York with lottery tickets of a red color. Right? That's a great, about the connection again that there was. Right? Go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, I think you mentioned that it's unlikely that Marti's readership would have been interested in this case or sympathetic to a black Cuban, and I don't think a Spanish consul would have really come to bat for someone like that either. I just don't think there would have been enough interest, and it wasn't part of his agenda,
But that's actually, if you review the press, if you review the press and you take all these newspapers, and I think the only place to do that really is in the microfilm room of the New York Public Library, because so these are not digital, except the New York Times. Some of them are, but is to, let's read what Marti was reading, right? And let's see, right, why he did not write about this or why he wrote about this, and why what he wrote about this was influenced by the press coverage, because that's the source. He wasn't in Charleston, he wasn't in Jonestown or whatever, right, Jamestown, with the flood, right? He wasn't in any of those places. He wasn't a stringer.
Charleston for the
right? Yeah. Charleston, yes. So this all came from the press, that
he followed the Garfield case.
Yes,
that makes sense.
Followed, yeah. Okay.
It might have been bad PR for Cubans, for Cuban stereotypes, the romance, the murder, the threesome.
That, by the way, there was another case involving a black Cuban that I also have in the book, but this was 1850s, and there was also another criminal case. And that was, just to mention it briefly, this was a guy named Félix Sanchez. He was the son. The crime occurred in 1857, so he was the son of a landowner in Cuba, with a landowner with, again, one of his slaves. He turned out to be very light-skinned, right? The father recognized him and sent him to New York, right, to learn to be a tailor. Right? But I think we can probably safely say that Félix Sanchez was crazy, right? I mean, he wasn't going to be a tailor. He had, what is that, attention deficit disorder, right? You know what I'm saying? So he marries this attractive African-American woman, and he's always jealous of her. And finally, in a fit of jealousy, he goes to kill her. The father gets in the way, and he has a sword, and he kills the father. He disappears. He's not caught, right? He surfaces about 2 months later in Louisiana, because it's one of those cases of, 20 years a slave, whatever, where a friend of his takes him to Louisiana, and once there, he says, hey, it's a slave. And he wants to sell him off.
Oh my.
Right? So he gets a friend of his that presumably goes with him, a white friend, sells him off. Right? And when he shows up at the slave auction, he says, whoa, wait a minute. I am a free person. In fact, there's a warrant for my arrest in New York for murder. and check on it, right? And so the New York Herald has the headline saying, rather execution than picking cotton in Louisiana, right? And so he said, and so he's brought back to New York, right? And he's again he's going to be executed. The Civil War comes in. After all this process, the Civil War comes in. I don't have any news of the execuation of Félix Sánchez. I don't have any news of the execution. But in the 1880 census, there is a Félix Sánchez, a colored man, according to the census, in the Blackwell Island lunatic asylum.
Oh, my goodness.
Oh, wow.
Right? He shows up at the local Blackwell Island, of course, was what is now Roosevelt Island.
It's una película.
Yeah, and so he shows up there as a Félix Sánchez, a colored man who is crazy. Right? Which, and after all, he pleaded, everybody said he was crazy, but, finally he proved them right. Oh, he almost killed an inmate in Tombs when he was there. So that's another crime and punishment case, right? Okay, any questions? What have we got?
Missing card.
Oh, it's early. I can go on.
Yeah.
Really? Let me, any piece of this that is missing from your point of view, particularly on the history of Cuban New York, because I can go back to that also as well, if you like. Go ahead.
I was wondering what might have influenced his writing of the essay Maestros Ambulantes. Do you have any information on that? What context?
I'm more an expert on New York than Marti. Tell me what that
Well, that was in 1884.
Yeah.
And he wrote that, and it
What
was
was it about?
traveling teachers and the need to connect, to educate in the rural areas, to make sure education got to the rural areas. And since he was in New York, I was just wondering what the influence of that might have been.
I don't know. I guess one of the things he might have thought highly of might have been the public school system in the United States, although that sometimes did extend to rural areas. So maybe that's what he was talking about disparities, right? But I'm not familiar with the chronicle. I can't really talk to it.
I have a question about the class breakdown of this Cuban group in New York, because you talked a lot about the elite. Obviously, they can't be the majority. But do you have any sense for how the breakdown was in terms of class?
Yes, I have actually a graph in the book in which I do, and this I haven't tried to read my hand, in which I do at least occupations. Okay, so the cigar workers do not become as evident, and particularly black cigar workers do not become as evident until about 1870. And then it really increases it by the 1880 census. Keep in mind, I'm using all these censuses, and I'm looking at occupational composition, right? And so I do have a breakdown of the occupation. Of course, there were many of these elites. It underestimates the elites, because if you were again a Cooper, we were after people who were Coopers and cigar workers and stuff like that, you would put that down. But if you were Cristobal Armada or you were Miguel Aldama, when you ask occupation, they put down gentleman. Right? So that they
That means they didn't.
Right, that didn't work, right? They're right, they were legal. So the occupational break, not everyone declared an occupation, but it was very heavy. And also, one of the things I haven't talked about is where they lived in New York, right? And this was the difference. The people, a lot of these people had a lot of money, right? I mean, like Miguel Aldama and these people, they later ran out of money. Aldama, for example, kind of runs out of money. But they mainly settled where you had, and Mahler and all of them, settled in areas where elite New Yorkers were settled, right? Which was essentially north of 14th Street. And Aldama even lived on 47th Street. Whereas, as you start getting the cigar workers coming in, they start going west and downtown. Because where the cigar workers lived in downtown was the areas that are now Tribeca, Soho, and the West Village, the West Village, Right? That area, that band of the West Village, Soho and Tribeca, is where you have a lot of boarding houses, right? That house cigar workers and so forth.
Well, how about Brooklyn?
I include Brooklyn in my data. Meaning I had to add it on, of course, because at this time, Brooklyn is a separate city.
Yes.
So I had to add them on. But there were cigar stores also as well. Right. But let me share something. I think going back to Estrada Palma and those guys and what they did in New York, because the the last chapter is actually an epilogue, because I finished with Marti, and I go into an epilogue, and that epilogue is called Marti should not have died. Marti no debió de morir. Ay de morir, right? Because in fact what happens is, and you know, Sitio Itier, who is a contemporary Cuban writer, says, the only Cuban prepared to face politically and culturally the historical turn of events of '98 was the same one whose death in combat 3 years before had facilitated that turn, right? And there's another quote by Máximo Gómez when '98 comes up, right? That is when the U.S. enters the war, when he says, this is when we needed Marti. This was his moment, right? In other words, the notion of the leadership, right? So, but so the degree of lobbying, right, that these people did was really incredible. After, again, en silencio tenido que hacer, as Martí said. No sooner does Martí die, and this is the anecdote in which I open that chapter. Edward H. Boyer, the principal of grammar school number 87 on Manhattan's Upper West Side, explained to the New York Herald reporter that, what can a principal do when people compliment him by visiting his school? Must he turn them away if he has doubt of their opinions? The principal was in a predicament that day in early June 1897. His boss, the superintendent of schools, was exercised about Boyer's decision the day before to allow into the school a group of highly opinionated foreign visitors who tried to, quote, enlist the sympathy of our boys, according to the superintendent, John Jasper. Quote, our children are sent to school to learn history, geography, and the 3 R's, Jasper charged, but not international politics or partisanship. It's a matter to be inquired into most carefully when a school principal allows such a thing in the school. The superintendent was reacting to a report in the Herald that, quote, several members of the Cuban junta, and in the press in New York, any Cuban group was referred to as the Cuban junta. It was always referred to as the Cuban junta. Several members of the Cuban junta had dropped into the grammar school on June 10th and had been allowed to lecture the youngsters on the abuses and atrocities of the Spanish against the Cuban people, and on the need for action by the President of the United States against Spain. It was, as the Herald headline described it, an invasion of a public school by a delegation of no less than 7 members of the Partido Revolucionario Cubano, including a staff leadership, Tomás Estrada Palma, General Julio Sanguilí, Benjamin Guerra, and Henry Lincoln Sayas. It was Sayas who delivered the anti-Spain speech to the students, and apparently did so very convincingly, for at the end of the Cubans' program, quote, when the principal asked if there were any whose parents came from Spain, the Herald reporter, the boys hissed vigorously. Now this is the level of lobbying that I'm talking about, right? Not only was Gonzalo de Quesada dispatched to Washington, right, by Estrada Palma to do the work of the Cuban legation, this was in an elementary school in the Upper West Side of Manhattan, right? So this was a total turnaround, right, to what essentially Martí had talked about all along, which was this notion, right, of keeping this, keeping this, and in-house, yeah. And the other thing is that the Partido Revolucionario Cubano also had included a guy by the name of Fidel Pierra, who had been a long-time resident of New York. And Fidel Pierra was essentially a fundraiser. He was like a university we call a development person, right? As early as September 1895, the PRC had already established a press bureau, right? Its name appeared exactly like that in English in the party's budget. The bureau was created by Fidel Pierra, a successful Cuban businessman who became active in the PRC after the death of Martí. Pierra measured the success of his bureau by about how many news and editorial pieces he was able to place in the US press, reporting in March 1896, for example, that his words had appeared in the Boston Herald and in the Shipping and Commercial List, the latter, he claimed, inspired an editorial in the New York Sun. In fact, he boasted to Estrada Palma in a letter that since the establishment of the Bureau, he had personally written or ghostwritten the equivalent of 100 pages that appeared in the U.S. press relating to all aspects of Cuban civilization and physical resources, obviously intended to heighten the interest of potential U.S. investors on the island. Vieira also claimed that he was personally funding many of the activities of the press bureau, spending $22 of his own money for every dollar assigned to the bureau by the PRC treasury. This was a press bureau, right? That the purpose was precisely to do this. Of course, none of this had the impact that the DeLome letter had, right? I mean, that came a few days, as you know, before the Maine, right? And that was part of what the leadership of the PRC did, which was there's a sympathizer. Enrique DeLome was the Spanish ambassador in Washington, right? And he writes a letter, right, to, in fact, in some sort of poll of historians, it's one of the 100 most significant documents of U.S. history, right, the DeLome letter. It was written, Enrique de León writes this letter to a colleague in Cuba, right, in 1990, right before the Maine, 1898, in which he, it's a personal letter, in which he basically insults McKinley, right? Says that the U.S. is never going to enter the war, that basically they're nothing but cowards anyway, and they're not ready. It's a highly insulting letter, which is intercepted by a Cuban sympathizer in the office of the Cuban colony, and sent to Estrada Palma in New York, right? Estrada Palma gets this explosive letter, right? And what does he do with it? He gives it to William Randolph Hearst. Right? And this happens, this sets the stage for the explosion of the Maine 2 days later. So this is, again, this is, go ahead.
I'm curious then about how democratic the PRC really was.
Okay.
Because presumably Marti's platform would have survived him if there were widespread support for it in the PRC. So I'm really curious about how does a new leader get to enact a different platform?
Well, I don't think there was a different platform. I just think that what Palma did was very different from that. I mean, I think they were still explicitly on the same principles of the PRC, except I think that strategy was very different. They acted very different. But there were, by the way, dissenting voices in New York over, and there was a guy named Enrique Trujillo. Trujillo was an individual who had a newspaper in New York. He had been a friend of Marti, right? And he voices, when the whole PRC constitution was drafted and everything, and the whole, thing, the programa de base del Partido Revolucionario Cubano was drafted, he voices precisely the concern about how democratic it is, and whether or not really it's el delegado. The delegado was the name of the top post, right? He was the delegate, so it was called, right? Because he was the delegate. Delegado, the amount of authority that a delegado had. But of course, again, you have to get into the backstory, right? Carmen Sayas Bazán, right, had come to New York in 1891, I believe. I have it in the book. In 1891, in one apparent last-ditch attempt to say, okay, coming back to Cuba, or you're not coming back to Cuba, right? And apparently there was a real falling out at this point. Carlos Ripoll, who writes a lot about Marti, says that she probably found out about the relationship with Carmen Millares, right? And there was a real falling out there, right? She needs permission to travel. In other words, to get permission from the Spanish consulate to travel back to Cuba to be issued a passport, right? And when Marti goes out of town, Enrique Trujillo takes her to the Spanish consulate and gets the permission without her husband, and she goes back to Cuba. When Marti comes back to New York, she's not there, and she's left with herself. And Enrique Trujillo was one individual in New York that Marti could not stand to be in the same room, right? We're all there, whatever. Enrique Trujillo was the guy that he held that, and I think that animosity translated itself, right, later on, right, when the PRC is established and Enrique Trujillo becomes a critic, right, and at this time they're personal enemies, right. But what you're saying about that is true, and Enrique Trujillo points that out in he has a great book, memoir of this period, right, of what's going on. He treats Marti fairly well because it's after Marti's death that he writes it. But he does point out that he had a lot of concerns about the fact that the PRC was actually not democratic, that the legal had really the authority on all of this. Right? By the way, Carmen Sayas Bazán returned to New York 2 months after Marti's death. And the New York Herald speculated that she had come back to claim an insurance policy, a life insurance policy. She denied that to the newspapers, right? That she had not come. But it's difficult to believe why she went to New York. And presumably the Herald reported that she had come back with the death certificate and everything of Marti, right? And it wouldn't have been surprising. I mean, Marti had this notion of his fatality, right? I mean, that he was not going to survive this. And this was a time in which both New York Life and Metropolitan Life were selling policies like crazy. It was a new concept, right? Life insurance, right? And they were selling policies like crazy, and it wouldn't have been. I've contacted both New York Life and Metropolitan Life with the leading ones to see if they had files. So it would be interesting to find if they had a life insurance policy, right? And the name of Marti. And whether it was actually made out to Carmen Sayas Bazán, right? You know? Because then she focuses her attention on the remaining days in New York, and then she goes back to Cuba. She was there only for a few days, and she stays with the Trujillos. Right? She stays with the Trujillos. And she writes, she asked Gonzalo de Quesada for the key to the office on Front Street, right? To recover whatever is there, right? And Gonzalo de Quesada, you know, and finally she writes, this is in the records of the PRC, by the way, the correspondence. She writes to Estrada Palma and says, Gonzalo de Quesada does not want to give me the key to Front Street, saying that some sort of rent issue that hasn't been paid and nobody can go in there, blah, 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 blah. I want to get in. So Estrada Palma finally produces the key. She goes in there and finds only books. There's no papers. And of course, we do know that Quesada and his son later on published, right, some of those books, some of the correspondence that was there. And she complains to Estrada Palma. She says, there is nothing there that, other than books, right, that is any record that Marti was ever there. And she complains about that. And then she heads back. Yes?
Professor, wanted to tell you that Enrique Trujillo is the person that receives the invitation for Marti to come to Tampa for the Partido Revolucionario group, Agramonte.
Right.
I don't know how the letter that Enrique Trujillo received in New York got to Marti.
I didn't know that. Yeah, I don't know. I didn't know that. So,
but they were already.
Yes, I think they were already on the outs, yes. And it was, you know, Marti was a conciliatory sort of person, right? I mean, he wanted to, you know, bring everybody under the umbrella, whatever, but Trujillo was too much for him. Trujillo was, he just could not,
Maybe
he couldn't get him, he could not get him. Right?
I think it's interesting, as you said, that Marti didn't write much about or anything about the Cuban immigrant community in New York, but he wrote extensively about the Cuban immigrant communities in Key West and Tampa, you know? And what that reveals to us about what these lessons that he's trying to teach to the rest of Latin America, and maybe some insight into what he views as a potential model or ideal sort of republic in the future. No? If it's a rejection of that New York aristocracy,
right.
Which nevertheless he was dependent upon.
Right.
Yes.
He doesn't give them press or promotion in Latin America.
And you know, part of that is that I do think that one of the reasons that he does go, boy, he's invited to go to Key West and Tampa and so forth, right? He's invited to go down. But I think part of the reason also is that Marti was, I sort of see him in New York in this period as a fairly solitary figure. That is, if you compare the Cuban community of 1890s with the one in 1870, right, when all that elite left and everything else, that was a very rich community in terms of intellectual resources. The entire elite of Havana was there. Whereas Marti, in terms of I think he was rejected by many of those who had fought in the war and lived there. I mean, there's widows that are living there. The widow of Cespedes, the widow of Agramonte, right? All of those are living in New York, right? And And he was sort of, didn't have the credentials, right? Didn't have the war credentials, right? And he's rejected by a lot of people in that community. And I think that's part of the reason also that influences him to say, okay, I'm going to start this not only from the ground up, but I'm going to start this in Florida, right? Because he's not, I don't think he's that, well, the one intellectual figure, there's a few intellectual figures of this time in New York, and one of them is a person that is not widely known, but Marti respected him a lot, but he was an annexationist all his life, and that was a guy by the name of José Rodriguez. José Ignacio Rodriguez arrived, he was a mentor of Mestre. He arrived in New York in that wave of 1869, 1870, right? And he became a lawyer, an international lawyer, and in fact fought many of the cases against the Spanish government in international courts for compensation for the losses in the 10-year war, right? And José Ignacio Rodriguez has, to this day, the best biography of Félix Varela. He has a biography of José Manuel Mestre, right? And he has a book of the history of Cuban exile activism on the annexationism, que se llama La anexión y otras causas de la revolución. It's an excellent book, right? And he was an important intellectual figure, and Martí respected him, but he was a committed annexationist from the beginning, right? And he dies in Washington in 1911, 1912, because he's an international lawyer who's fighting many cases there. And his archives, his entire archive in the 1930s was donated by his daughter to the Library of Congress. And that archive is virtually untouched, right? I mean, the letters are still in their envelopes, right? There's a collection there, which I have a copy of in my book, of the bonds that were being issued during the 10-year war for independence. There's a stack of them like this. The bonds that, by the way, got Aldama and all that in trouble, because they were giving these bonds out to, these were bonds that were payable upon the independence of Cuba, right? And they were giving these out to senators and representatives, right? And Grant and Hamilton Fish, actually, who's another figure here, the Grand Secretary of State, was like, what? Shut these guys down, right? You know, in terms of bribery and everything else. But the only one who's worked that file is Ramiro Guerra, the historian, right? Back in the 1940s. Because there's notes by Ramiro in the file, right? But that file is virtually untouched, and I used it because it actually has a lot on this period. But I think, to your point, I think Martí was, I see him as a sort of fairly solitary intellectual within the Cuban period at this time. And I think in many ways, politically, I think he rejects New York. Right? I mean, that's part of the reason. Yeah.
I'm curious about how, in fact, Tomás Estrada Palma becomes this leader. And did José Martí invite him to be this sort of second person, vice president, or I mean, how does, it's hard to reconcile. And because I'm curious about the tenement cigar workers that were also nearby that he also doesn't write about.
I think part of the, going back to this point about him being a fairly solitary figure, I think also that Estrada Palma had legitimacy from the previous war. That is, he had some credentials, right, as an exile from the previous war. And I think Martí was looking for that. I think this was a way, I mean, he doesn't actually, he sort of anoints Estrada Palma as a follower of this, but I think his thinking was, I don't know what his thinking might be, but my face was, his thinking on that was that Estrada Palma was how should I say this, a figure that would have been respected in New York.
Yeah, he was an American citizen, he was educated.
He was
But he was an annexation.
Well, yeah, although he comes out, you know, he's from Miami, right? And he comes out of the same group that started the war in 1868. In fact, he was a good friend of Francisco Aguilera. So he has a legitimacy from that war that I think Martí sort of wanted in that position. And I don't know, it's, you know, yes, it might be hard to think, but I don't know. By the way,
alternative.
now that I mentioned Aguilera, by the way, Aguilera was one of those New York Cubans. Let me get finish the point. Aguilera was sent by Céspedes to try to fix the situation, the conflict between the Cubans in 1871 in New York, right? And one of the most telling things, I do play a little bit in the book with the regional differences, right? Because the people that represented Céspedes in New York were from Havana. which brought about resentment from many of the people who then started leaving from Eastern Cuba. Right? And Aguilera writes this after he realizes, he's had contact with Aldama and all these guys from Havana in New York. He writes this letter to Estrada Palma, who's his friend, that's why I bring it up, that says, when he says, our cause has suffered tremendously from our lack of understanding of the men of the West. Right? Like these are not the guys, these are not our guys. You know what I'm saying? These are not the guys that are willing to give everything up here. Right? Go ahead, I'm sorry. You got
No, I was going to say, it related to this is, last time we were talking with Jerry, that this idea that I had never thought about before, of Marti in the late 1880s, sort of warming to the idea of maybe autonomy is the only way of surviving, of Cuba achieving.
Next step.
And one has this idea of Marti as extremely radical, and I think a lot of that happens in the 90s after he comes here and realizes that he has a new source of funds. But that might be behind part of his decision to name Estrada Palma, thinking maybe this is the only way that it's going to eventually happen.
I don't know, it is hard to figure that. It is, you were saying what he was, and yeah.
Yeah, I'm wondering if these other New York Cubans viewed Marti as something other than Cuban, because he was in exile most of his life, so he really wasn't a figure in Cuba. He was a figure in Spain. Yeah. So did they accept him as a Cuban patriot?
But the interesting thing was that many of the ones who said they were true patriots in New York were actually people who had the fiercest critics of Aldama and the Havana group for taking over the leadership in New York in 1870 were in fact the ones that had arrived as a result of the annexationist group. Two examples, Cirilo Villaverde and Emilia Casanova, they were a couple, right? Right? Those guys had arrived with the Narciso Lopez thing, right? And lived in New York. And later evolved to be independentistas, right? And they felt that these guys coming from Havana, with all their money and all this stuff, and that Céspedes had given them the mantle of leadership, of representation in New York, they were very resentful of that. Right? They're and they were tremendous. I spent a lot of time in one chapter talking about how these people really hated each other, right? Cirilo Villaverde, Emilia Casanova, the Cisneros brothers, all of those formed a faction in New York that totally opposed the Havana group, right? And there was a lot of fighting in between, and that's why Aguilera, Céspedes sends Aguilera in the hope, right, of solving that. And Aguilera, of course, is the vice president of the Republic, and he's unable to do that. He dies in New York, right? And he's unable to do that. So it's interesting that some of the more radical, the stuff that Emilia Casanova would write about Aldama, el benemérito Aldama, que se pasa, he spends his day going around Manhattan in his carriages, eating pasteles. Right? I mean, really, literally, I mean, the language of Emilia Casanova reminds me of some of the stuff in Miami in the 70s, stuff like that. I mean, she's really a very acerbic pen. And by the way, if some of you in literature, if you, and I could send it to you, whatever, if you're interested, I mean, part of it, I have a little theory there about Cecilia Valdés. Right? Cecilia Valdés comes out in New York, right? After this whole experience of Villaverde and Casanova with the Havana elite, whom they hated. And as you know, Cecilia Valdés is an indictment of precisely that social class, right? And I have the theory that Villaverde retakes that novel, right, which he wrote an earlier version of. He retakes that novel, right, that this was influenced by that kind of struggle that they had in New York, that kind of conflict that they had. And it ran against my instincts, because I have discovered in talking about Cuban things that you never want to engage the people who are in literature with discussion.
There are some exceptions.
because you generally find, you generally find, if you don't ever say to anybody who's an expert on Cuban literature, no, I don't know, Paradiso, Carpentier, I just don't get it, whatever, because it's like people who are experts in literature treat you like you are not even entitled to have read that. You know what I'm saying? Much less have an opinion on it, right? You know what I'm saying? If you have not been trained in it, and I say, no, frankly, I've never been able to finish that. And so I'm making a judgment here on Cecilia Valdez, and this is the most dangerous thing I've done in this school, right? Which is to get myself into the literary areas, right? Right?
Well, one more, yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I was just been thinking, is there on the topic of how Marti changes from the late 1880s to the 1890s, does he write much about race in the 1880s? Is that something that also maybe developed in the 1890s? Is that do those things maybe develop kind of in lockstep?
I have a feeling, and again, I hope I've told you that I'm coming to Marti through the New York lens because I want to write something about New York. So I'm not, I don't consider myself an expert on Marti in that sense, although I learned a lot about him through this. But I have the feeling that the stuff on race has to do when he has the agenda of doing a unified.
Right.
Yes.
Right. Yeah.
Right. So when he needs to bring people together here, right? And because I don't think he's writing much about that.
Oh, yeah.
There's some like in Ensayo Político in Cuba, where he writes about the what was his name, Viejo, about the black prisoner who's with him in the quarries in Havana, where there's a different lens. There's a more sympathetic lens, but it's nothing like what happens.
Because when you put it that way, it sounds pretty opportunistic.
Well, let me tell you, I had to redo my chapter on Marti because when I shared the first draft with these writers in the Coleman Center that I was in the New York Public Library, there were some biographers in there, they came back saying, I kind of don't like this guy, right? And the reason, okay, let's see. He goes to New York because he's got this mission to liberate Cuba, but he doesn't get around to doing that until like 10 years later. Number two, he leaves us, he allows his wife and daughter to go back to essentially abandons his family so he can dedicate to his mission. Then he's the stringer for newspapers in New York. I mean, we don't like him, right? So I said, okay, let me look at that chapter again. You say, I don't want to, do a number on Marti here, but yeah, there are some things about Marti there that you could, God forbid, be sort of critical of, right? In many ways. And I know this was, in kindergarten when I celebrated, when I had to take, do a picture of Marti and do a frame for it and everything else, and we thought he was some sort of god and whatever. This is the way he's been treated in the Cuban. But I've come around to Marti, I should say, because of this research, because because the guy really did have, whatever you might say about him and women and everything else, which is true, the man's foresight, right, on this, right, on the political moment and what was needed was really quite extraordinary. And the way in which he's able to break that mold of Cuban émigré activism and say, no, we're not going to do it this way, we're going to do it this way. It was really quite extraordinary.
And he never has to deal with the messiness of it, right? So he died, not the benefit of dying in 1895, but historically, we don't ever have to see him wrestle with the coalition government. We don't have to see him do all of that.
Yes,
so forever
who knows what history would have. And the veneration of Marti is not an instant thing either, as some of you know. Marti had to be discovered a little bit late, right? It's not, and you're right, who knows where he would have stand. So, but it is what Cynthia said, in many ways, that would have been his moment. Right? That's when you needed the diplomat. That's when you needed the statesman. That's when you needed not the guy who gets on a horse and rides off and gets shot. Right? Let me get that one back in then yours. Go ahead. Go ahead, sir.
Cuban Masonry
yes.
was very strong in New York with La Logia Universal. Can you address some of that?
There are very early cases of Freemasons in New York. That I talk about. There's actually a Masonic lodge in the 1850s that's already been established in the 1850s, right? And then there was a family that came in, again, little known in history because they didn't feature into any other stuff, but it was a family of Freemasons who established also, maybe it's this lodge that you're talking about, but established a lodge of Cubans in New York. These were the Angaricas, Jose Angarica and Joaquin Angarica. They're buried at Greenwood as well. And their thing is, it's an entire plot of all, and they have, it's a kind of an obelisk that they have. And on one side they have the Masonic, symbol, and the other hand they have a royal palm.
Oh, wow.
Right? By the way, just to, and I'll get to your question in a minute. I don't have the time. I don't want to look at my clock because it might ring again. But I haven't talked about something that I mentioned to James and to Dennis. Benjamin Guerra, right? Is the treasurer of the Partido Revolucionario Cubano, right? Lately, there's been research that's been done in Cuba. The notion has always been that Benjamin Guerra committed suicide, right? In a hotel in Philadelphia in January of 1900, right? He was the treasurer of the Cuban Revolutionary Party, and the theory has always been that there was something that it couldn't have been a woman, so it must have been financial stuff, right, with the Partido Revolucionario Cubano. Ibrahim Hidalgo Paz, who's an investigator at the Centro de Estudios Materiales, has just published this really, really excellent book on forensic accounting, in which he's looked at the books of the Partido Revolucionario Cubano, which are in New York, right? And he says that there was no evident fraud in the books. In fact, that Benjamin Guerra contributed some of his own money, right? So he writes to me and says, well, what can you dig up about Benjamin Guerra? Benjamin Guerra his partner was Barranco, his name was Barranco. They sold cigars. He boards a train, goes to Philadelphia on a Friday night, arrives there. He shows up dead in his hotel room the following day, right? And since then, there's been the idea, and he immediately, a nephew of his, recovers the body, and he's buried in Greenwood, in an unmarked grave in the family plot of the Barrancos, his partner, right? The assumption was that he was always, this had been a suicide, and it had something to do with the books of the PRC, right? So I look into the newspaper of Philadelphia, and I dig up the original death certificate, right? And what happens, right? The coroner in Philadelphia refuses to rule the death a suicide, because in fact, Guerra was addicted to laudanum.
Oh, boy.
Oh, wow.
Right? And he apparently overdosed.
Overdosed.
He overdosed. He was on the bed. There was a gun near him, but it hadn't been fired. But again, he would have traveled with a gun anyway, probably. Right? And so, Guerra is now being sort of whatever. And the people in Greenwood, they have a whole commercial enterprise going there. They have tours and they have concerts and everything. It's a beautiful cemetery in Brooklyn. One of the things that they do is they put now gravestones on prominent. So I finally talked them into putting a gravestone for Benjamin Guerra. So we're going to inaugurate that probably in the next few months to have a gravestone for Benjamin Guerra, who's sort of been a little bit, mistreated. Apparently, did not commit suicide, may not have involved in anything funny. I'm sorry, you had something you wanted.
No, I was saying that his sensitivity or racial issues, some of that. I think there is a very early poem where he says, when he sees this scene of a slave hanging, and he says, un niño lo vio y tembló de pasión por los que gimen. So that's very early. I think it's a very early poem. So even though when he started treating this issue different in the US, this was in Cuba. It was back in Cuba, it was a very early poem, so he starts, you can register. There was this awareness since very early. Politically, he meant, it was all this scene when he got here and everything, but it was very early when he started having this kind of, so.
He has a sensibility about it, but it's later that he has.
Yeah.
Right. But things don't just, come out just one day. You get up and say, oh, I'm going to. It's something that has a process, right? So.
Yeah, of course. No, it's just it's like the phrasing, like he needs a unified coalition. And
right.
And
that's why I said politically, he must have realized of the need for that kind of thing. But definitely you can register, this kind of awareness is very early, right? So
You know that the first novel about slavery in Cuba was not written by a Cuban. It was written by Victor Hugo when he was 16 years old, and it's called Boug Jargal. He traveled to Cuba and stayed at a sugar plantation and was so impressed by what he saw that he wrote a novel, which he was a kid, Boug Jargal. It's in French. he was 16, so I'd have to look up his birthday. Yeah, that predates all of the anti-slavery novels in Cuba.
All right, Lisandro, thank you.
What do we do? You
Well,
tell.
we can take a couple more
Yeah,
questions.
yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, I don't know what the time constraint is. Yes, go ahead, yes.
So I want to argue for the potential recuperation of Marti's gender politics through the lens of a comment that James made about the way that he rejected the elites of New York and embraced the workers of Tampa and Key West especially, through like an intellectual coherence of requiring total humility, sacrifice, and generosity from the other, right? Whether you're a man who has a dream and wants that from your wife to support whatever your vision is, or whether you're an intellectual political leader who wants to enact change in the world rather than just writing essays in your home about it, right? You need this total self-sacrifice from others who are willing to submit their will and their resources to your intellectual ideological project. So there's a coherence between the kinds of supporters he valued and what he expected from or wished he had from the women in his life. And I think this is really fascinating because in both cases, these are also, ironically, exploitative labor systems.
Okay.
Yeah.
Sounds like a project to me. And it would be very innovative, I think. Because I think that those gender dimensions of Marti have not been really looked at. I would think, yes. Go ahead, I'm sorry.
So earlier you mentioned the Montilla family.
Yes.
And can you elaborate a little bit about his relationship with them and his possible relationship with the wife?
Yeah, okay, so this is the paternity issue, right? Marti arrives in New York in January. By late January, he is already in the Montilla household. Later on, about a couple of months later, maybe sooner than that, he leaves for Venezuela, right? And spends a couple of months in Venezuela, then comes back. In October of 1880, he is at the christening of Maria Montilla, who is the daughter of Carmen, right, the head of the boarding house. And he is the godfather in the christening in the church in Brooklyn. Right? And the argument has always been that this is Marti's daughter, right? Montilla was still alive. The generation of El Apóstol, that is the generation of Cuban writers who talked about Marti el Apóstol, right? Reject that, saying Marti could not possibly have done such a thing with a married woman, right? And the last of those, by the way, was Ripoll. Carlos Ripoll was the one who argued. There is a book called La Niña de Nueva York, right, by a Colombian writer who argues for the paternity, Marti paternity of Maria. And so, you know, they didn't have DNA testing then, I guess. And so that gives, Carlos Márquez Sterling, who writes a biography of Marti, says an impartial judge would reserve judgment, right? But here's something like, but probably a more perceptive, whatever, would probably condemn him. Right, something like that. He kind of plays both sides of that. Even Ripoll, however, does say that after the death of Manuel Montilla, right, which I think must have been a few years after that, that yes, that Marti and Carmen did live as a couple in the same boarding house, but in separate rooms, right, and that they were a couple. And this is probably what Carmen discovered, if she hadn't known it already when she went in 1891. The argument was that both Carmen, by the way, Carmen Montilla, who's Carmen Millares, is buried in Woodlawn Cemetery in the Bronx. She's not in Greenwood, she's in Woodlawn in the Bronx. Right? She died in about 1920. She always maintained the business of having a boarding house. Right? And she's buried there. Eusebio Leal, who's the historian of Havana, I accompanied him to, he wanted to lay flowers on, this was 2 years ago, on the tomb of Maria, of Carmen, right? And so we went up there. It's a little stone. It's just a little stone and it was covered by snow that day because he went in February. Maria went on to marry an individual by the name of Cesar Romero. She had a daughter named Cesar Romero, who's Cesar Romero. was the Joker in Batman, right? The Hollywood actor, right? And she died in Los Angeles.
And who claims that when he came to Tampa,
Yeah.
he claimed that he was direct descendant
of
of
Marti.
José Martí.
Yes.
And that he liked to sport his mustache,
Yes.
like his
By
abuelo.
osmosis.
Right, and she also, by the way, Maria also visited Cuba, and she was received as a daughter of Marti, and she even had an encuentro, right, a meeting with the son of Marti, with Carmen Sayama's son. Yes, we keep going here. You tell me. I mean, I can.
I'll let Dennis.
Uno más.
Uno más. Okay. Yes.
Among the small group, not a huge group, but the small group that received José Martí at midnight, that night that he first arrived in Ybor City, was Ramón Rubiera de Armas,
Okay.
who had lived in New York and who had debated against Martí. Can you tell us something about this
You know what I
man?
can tell you about him, and if you have any more information about it, I would appreciate it. Ramón Rubiera was one of those who appealed to the governor for the commutation of Miguel Chacón's sentence.
He was elected here in Tampa
Yeah.
on 2 separate occasions as a city councilman
Yeah.
from Ybor City because everybody associated José Martí with this lector who had a rooming house and a fonda
Yeah.
in Ybor City where José Martí first stayed. Lisandro,
Yeah.
this man,
Yeah.
Rubiera,
Rubiera.
must have been significant
Yeah.
in New York.
Yeah, you know, one of the things that I had to decide in this book is I had to leave out a lot of stories and a lot of people that I couldn't flesh out the story and include it in the narrative, because otherwise the narrative would have gone all over the place, right? I can tell you there was another family, of course I didn't include them because they became really well known in the 20th century, which were the Acostas. Ricardo Acosta arrived in 1869, 1870, and married eventually into a very prominent Spanish family in New York. They were descendants of the Duchess of Alba and everything else. And they had a really interesting set of children, right? One of them was what became known as Rita Laide, who was she married very young into the upper reaches of New York aristocracy, to the Stokes family, right? And there's a famous painting of her by Bernini, and she was this beauty, and she married 3 or 4 times. She finally married a Episcopal bishop who got excommunicated because he married her. And then the other daughter, Mercedes was a playwright, right? Who was presumably, according to her, had a relationship with Greta Garbo and other women, and of which there is a biography of her called That Furious Lesbian.
Yeah, wow.
I mean, this was on a whole family, but this now goes into the 20th century, so that was a whole family you could talk about.
The Recovery Project has that too.
Right. And she wrote an autobiography called Therein Lies the Heart. This was a very interesting family. They were major donors to the construction of the new St. Patrick's Cathedral. And they had their name on one of the pews. So that, I mean, there's a lot of stories that actually come out of this. Once you start, who's this and who's that, right?
All right, well, I suggest we